I thought it would be fun for us to go through every argument for the existence of God that mankind has made up and point out where they go wrong. These will be classical philosophical and theological arguments, and frankly, many of them are not very convincing, not very good, and so I want to dissect and analyze all that with you today. And in so doing, it's not really about proving God to you, of course. That would be silly. It's about looking at the epistemology, how to do effective metaphysics, if there is such a thing, and the many traps that come with trying to wrap your mind around God, because this is where humans make all sorts of foolish mistakes that I'll be pointing out. Now, of course, a warning is that this topic requires a high degree of open-mindedness and epistemic intelligence, which is rare, so keep that in mind. This is a serious, advanced philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, and theology, and this is going to present a trap for you if you're a scientific materialist or you're an atheist or you're a skeptic. So be careful with this debunking mindset. What we're doing here is we're not presenting any kind of simplistic answers or any kind of ideology or belief system. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a believer. I don't have any faith. I'm not religious. However, I do have to let the cat out of the bag because, as I was structuring this talk, I was thinking about how do I present this in a very even-handed manner, because there's going to be theists watching and there's going to be atheists watching and all sorts of people in between those camps, skeptics and so forth. And how do I present the topic in a fair way to everybody? Because we don't want to, bias and privilege one side over the other. And so I thought I would just kind of neutrally go through the arguments. But then I realized as I was, spent a lot of time thinking about this, I can't really do that because, of course, I'm coming from a pretty unique position. If you're new to this work, to this channel, then and you're not familiar with myself and my background, then, of course, the problem here is that I do have a direct consciousness of God. So I can't pretend otherwise. And so I'm coming at this whole topic from a very unique angle, because you can find a lot of topics about this question on YouTube from scientific people, theological people, from Christians and from skeptics and philosophers and so forth, academics. But you see, the problem is that, well, they don't really know what they're talking about. And that's because they don't have a direct consciousness of God. And it doesn't matter whether they believe in God or don't believe in God. That's irrelevant. What matters is what you're conscious of. So the whole point of this topic and why it's interesting is because we're going to be evaluating these proofs from a position of already having the final answer. I have the final answer. I know what that is. So that makes evaluating the proofs very easy. Now, of course, the problem is that from your point of view, especially if you're new to all this, you have no idea if I have the final answer or if I'm full of shit or whatever. You can't know that. So what do? Well, of course, skepticism is good. Always be skeptical, although you have to be careful about how you apply the skepticism because it is possible to deceive yourself with your own skepticism. So just be aware of that. But really, how you evaluate the quality of the analysis is you look at the actual analysis and you look at the actual quality of the epistemology that's being done here, right? So the focus is on the epistemology, not on convincing you of God. That's not what this is about. So what's different about the way that I'm going to cover this topic from how other philosophers, academics, theists, Christians, atheists, and scientists cover this topic is that I'm not going to be engaging in any speculation. There's not going to be any belief systems. There's no faith. There's no dogma. There's no ideology. There's not even a paradigm, like a materialist or a scientific paradigm. And there's no rationalization. This is mostly what you get from those people, because if you don't have a direct consciousness of God, what else can you have but those things? But of course, if you're an atheist or a skeptic or an academic scholar of philosophy, then this seems kind of already unfair and biased of me to come at this, topic from that angle, because you might wonder, well, Leo, you're already assuming the conclusion. But I'm not assuming the conclusion. I've come to the answer. So here is where you have to really open your mind to the possibility that it is possible to come to some answer, and that it's not just all up as a matter of relative perspective and opinion. And that it is actually possible to say something meaningful and accurate about the nature of God. It's just very rare that people do so, because most people don't know what they're talking about when it comes to this idea. That's just the situation we're in. The purpose of this episode, and the ones that are going to come as part of a series here, is we're going to be answering the question, the profound question of why proofs and evidence for God are so epistemically problematic. That's the really interesting question, not whether God exists or not. It's really, why is it so damn hard to understand what God is? Or to even come to know that God exists? Why is that so hard? Because you would think that if God existed, it should be easy, right? Such a crazy thing, if it was real, should be easy to know, first of all, that it's true. Second of all, why it's true and how it works, the mechanics of the whole thing. Like, supposedly, if God exists, how did God come into existence? That's the real question here, right? How do you answer that? Why is that so difficult to answer? That's really what we're after here, is an answer to that question. So let's get going. To get started, of course, we first need to define what we mean by God, because different people can have different ideas. But really here, I mean the very classic philosophical definition, which is a supreme being, the creator of reality, world, or universe. I'm using all those words synonymously here. The source, with the capital S, infinite, unlimited, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, intelligent, loving and benevolent, eternal, which means has existed forever, beyond time, transcends time and space, more fundamental than time and space, immaterial, formless, transcendent, and also immanent, absolute, truth itself, perfection, unity, oneness, infinite mind. This is what I mean by God. This is a very good definition, but also, see, it's tricky because even if you somehow realize God, or somehow prove God with some kind of argument, the problem is that it's not enough to just prove God. You have to also understand all of these different aspects and facets and properties of God. And there's quite a few of them, and at times they can seem contradictory. How do you explain why God has all these attributes if God even exists? That's not so obvious. What I don't mean by God is I don't mean a bearded man in the clouds. That's a childish notion of God, so drop that idea. You got to be very careful if you're an atheist or a skeptic that you're not arguing against a straw man of what a God is. So if you're arguing against the bearded man in the clouds idea, then yeah, you win that argument. No doubt about that. So we're all in agreement about that. We're talking about a much higher level of what we mean by God, right? So just understand that there's different definitions and versions of God. There's very childish, ridiculous, fundamentalist ones. And then as you go up the scale, it gets more sophisticated, advanced. It gets more philosophical, basically. You're transcending traditional religion and you're getting into some heavy metaphysical stuff. I also don't mean the Christian God, and I don't mean Christ, and I don't mean the Trinity. I don't mean a human-like entity or a personal being. I don't mean a material creature like aliens that have invented the universe, that are sitting outside the universe, and the universe is just a simulation, and those aliens are the God. That's not what I mean. And I also don't mean a mythological symbol, story, or a metaphor. So people like Jordan Peterson, for example, or Jonathan Pajot, they will like to wax philosophical and symbolical and mythological, sort of mythopoetically, about God being this ultimate symbol in a hierarchy of symbols and all this kind of stuff. I don't mean that. We're not talking about stories here. I'm being very literal about the nature of existence. That's what we're talking about, is the nature of existence. Also, for those of you who are kind of skeptics and scientist types and rational types, to help you get on the proper framing here, rather than thinking of God as this personal Christian being in the clouds, rather think of God more as existence and reality itself. Imagine if God was synonymous with reality. But of course, now the question is like, well, if God is just synonymous with reality and existence, well, that's seems kind of like a word game or some kind of like mental trick that's being played here. Because we already know existence and reality, here it is, so where's the God, and why call it God, and why give it these weird religious qualities and attributes, some sort of trick is being played here, right? Well, that's the trick is figuring out how to reconcile those two things. But if you really want a serious straw-man version of what people really mean by God and why we talk about God at all, you have to get away from these childish Christian notions of God, and you have to get into God as reality itself. And then we can talk about what that really means, and we can go into a lot of depth on that. So that makes it a little bit more plausible for you. A little bit more plausible. Now, before we get into the arguments, a few notes here. So, of course, for this topic, we're doing serious philosophy here. So what that means is when we're doing philosophy, there's some principles for what it means to be a good philosopher, and not just to half-ass it or to do some sort of, one of these debunking efforts, which is not serious philosophy. It means that you need to mount a good faith, serious consideration of every perspective, every philosophical perspective, even the ones you personally disagree with. You have to have a certain even-handedness to how you consider various perspectives. That's what philosophy is all about. It's about considering different perspectives, not about just defending your personal pet belief system. So that's a key distinction between good and bad philosophy. And because, philosophy can be used as a rationalization for anything you believe. And that's what we want to avoid, is just engaging in rationalizations of our pre-existing metaphysics. That's the trap. Also, you need to make a distinction between steel-manning and straw-manning perspectives. So we're going to look at the steel-manned versions of all these arguments. Many of these arguments I personally don't like and don't agree with, and I wouldn't make them if I was trying to convince somebody. But we have to consider them because maybe there's something we don't understand. Maybe there's more depth to it, more subtlety and nuance that we're missing, right? So for this reason, we have to steel-man the arguments, and then we'll pick them apart and see whether they hold any water. Also, it's important to note here that when I say proofs of God, this is a very loaded word, proof. I don't necessarily mean an airtight proof, because that's what you think about, right? It's like, give me an airtight proof that if I tell it to anybody, they'll just drop to the floor and start praying to God. Again, this is a sort of a childish notion of what a proof is. Proof is actually a very loaded notion, and I'm going to have a whole episode coming after this one that's going to be deconstructing the very notion of what proof is. So that's going to be very profound. So we're just setting that up here. But proof, I'm using that word synonymously with arguments. These are arguments. And you have to consider that an argument might be able to only take you so far. Even if you had an airtight proof that was logically 100% deductively sound, if you had a syllogism that proved God, just consider how human psychology works and the fact that even that would fail to persuade many people. Because there's a difference between the truth of reality, the factualness of something, and whether you're able to persuade somebody of it. These are very different things. And to persuade somebody means you have to go through their ego. And if you know even a little bit of what ego is, that's a whole hornet's nest right there. So how are you going to navigate all the egoic tricks that the ego plays to try to persuade somebody of anything? Could be God or really anything. That's the challenge of epistemology, of doing quality epistemology. So just be aware, even if there is a proof for God, it doesn't mean that it's going to convince you, so you can't judge these proofs by whether it convinces you personally. Because that's a very psychological notion. It's even a sociological notion because you have various kinds of epistemic and metaphysical priors that you got from your culture, which shape what you consider persuasive and plausible. Do not think of yourself as some sort of neutral, third-party, hyper-rational agent who is sitting there and carefully, methodically logicking through life and then, deciding what's true and false based on that. That's not at all how human psychology works. Nobody's mind actually works that way. That's not how our worldviews are developed. That's not how we're convinced to change our minds either. Oftentimes, we're convinced by things like profound suffering or crazy love emotional things, not logical things. Of course, in this whole series, we're going to get very, very logical. We're not going to be making any appeals to emotion here. It's all going to be appeals to logic. But remember, again, I could give you the perfect logic and it would have no effect on you. So just keep that in mind, even if you're very scientific. You think that you're persuaded by logic. Be careful that you're not fooling yourself. Once again, beware of the misuse of skepticism. Skepticism is a powerful tool, but it can be abused when you use it to immediately pick apart an argument, right? Sometimes, also keep in mind that an argument, an advanced, subtle argument about the very nature of existence, could it maybe be the case that such an argument isn't just something you hear within a few minutes and then you immediately decide in your mind whether it's true or false, and then you immediately rip it apart and debunk it, and then you move on with your life? Maybe there's a little bit more to understanding reality than that kind of mode, that kind of approach. Maybe these arguments need to be mulled and contemplated for hours and for years to see the nuances of them, to try to understand maybe how you're misunderstanding them, how you're inadvertently, even if you don't want to, you could be strawmanning them. You see, this is good philosophy when you start to think this way. And this requires that you are also able to put your skepticism on pause. That doesn't mean you're going to believe just to believe stuff. You're going to put your skepticism on pause enough to be able to really shift outside of your paradigm to consider another paradigm. Then later you can step back into your old paradigm. But people are quite resistant to switching paradigms, which is why good philosophy is quite rare, because most of us are stuck in one paradigm or another. Also consider that skepticism itself, rationalism, scientific materialism, cynicism, nihilism, these are also paradigms. Paradigm doesn't just mean the false stuff, the fictions of superstitious people or conspiracy theories or bad forms of logic and reasoning. Paradigm means every way that you fundamentally can look at reality. So paradigms are very deep and tricky things, and don't underestimate how stuck you could be in your own paradigm. Also consider that many of these proofs only work in retrospect. And this is true not just of proofs about God, but just in general, much of logical proofs. If we exclude stuff like mathematics, but we consider the empirical world, questions about the empirical world. Is the earth round or not? And do planets orbit or are they stationary in the sky? Sorts of stuff. Like questions like these are empirical questions. So for this, logic by itself is not enough. You also need some sort of grounding in contact with reality. And so a lot of times we think that we're very logical in how we do science, but if you actually examine the workings of science carefully, accurately, and not just the myth of science, then you'll realize that a lot of the logic of science is actually retroactive, retrospective. We discover something by accident or by a leap of intuition or even just by a belief, faith, or whatever. And then once we verify it through some sort of, lucky experiment or whatever, then we can come back and we can logic through why it was true. But that doesn't mean that we could have arrived at it through logic alone, because you can have multiple different systems or models that are logical and self-consistent and coherent, locally coherent, and they're all going to be competing with each other, and you're not going to be able to distinguish between one or the other, which one is actually true of empirical reality. And also consider that these proofs might have multiple layers to them, and that certain aspects of these or certain layers of these arguments and proofs, the surface layers, can be false or silly and ridiculous and kind of unscientific and illogical. But then you can get below those, if you're very careful with how you use your mind, you can get below those to deeper layers of these arguments and proofs, which actually have deep truths within them. So also consider that possibility. All right, so let's get into the first proof or argument, which is called the cosmological argument. The way all these proofs are going to go is there's usually multiple steps to them, so I'm going to go through all the steps in sort of a logical sequence so that you can see how they all connect together. And then we're going to go back and sort of evaluate each step in the sequence and see where it goes right, where it goes wrong, and discuss. Okay, so here's the cosmological argument. First step is everything that exists has a cause. Is that true? Look for yourself. Is that true? Everything that exists around you doesn't have a cause. Have you ever encountered a thing that does not have a cause? The universe exists, so it too must have a cause. That's the logic. Step 2 is that there cannot be an infinite chain of causes. Step 3, the cause of the universe cannot come from inside the universe, it must come from outside the universe. Because if it came from the inside, this would be logically impossible or ridiculous and nonsensical. Because in some weird way, we would have to say that the universe caused itself. Step 4 is the cause of the universe must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, very powerful, and absolutely simple. Otherwise, it would depend on parts which need other causes to explain them. And so, if there were other parts to this cause, then it would just create the infinite regress problem again. And so why must it be timeless and spaceless as immaterial? Well, because by definition, time and space and materiality are aspects of the universe. So, and we're talking about something that's outside the universe. And so, therefore, that simple, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, very powerful, absolutely simple cause is God. So that's the whole argument, the cosmological argument. So what do you think? By the way, I'm very curious to see if you guys would want to rate in the comments section, if you want to give a 1 out of 10 rating, 10 being that you're super convinced and you love the argument, and 1 being that it's a shitty argument. Post down below. We'll compare who thinks what of these arguments. So here's my analysis of this argument. So let's go back to the first point. Everything that exists has a cause. That's true if you're looking inside the universe. Everything has a cause. The universe exists, that's true, so it must have a cause. This is not so obvious. So here's where we start to really run into the problem of assumptions. All of these arguments, and really any logic and any argument about anything, not just God, is going to involve assumptions. And this is where the self-deception starts to happen. This is where the sloppy thinking starts to happen, is that there's many assumptions that we make when we reason and think about making sense of reality that we're not conscious of our own assumptions, and we take them for granted, and then this gets us into trouble. In fact, I have a whole episode called Assumption is the Mother of All Fuck-Ups. Go look at that episode. And I'm going to need another episode about assumptions because the nature of assumptions is so profound and advanced that it's responsible for so many problems that I'm going to have to do another episode on it, despite the very comprehensive and good one that I already have. So really what we have to do when we're doing good philosophy is we have to ask ourselves, what are the assumptions of all these different arguments and worldviews? And we have to question all the assumptions. And this is really the heart of what skepticism is. And this is where I love skepticism, is in the questioning of assumptions. This is skepticism done properly. So what is the assumption here? The assumption here is that the stuff that's going on inside the universe, that we can use that to empirically understand that, well, everything in the universe has a cause, so therefore the thing outside the universe must also have a cause. That's not obvious, you see. What's the assumption here? Well, the assumption here is that we can make extrapolations about what we found inside the universe to outside the universe. That's an open question. That's a very, very open question. And you can't just assume that, for example, the laws of physics apply outside the universe. And of course, it's more than just physics, but really the metaphysics, even science has metaphysics. Even physics has metaphysics, because physics assumes things like cause and effect, time and space. This is more than just physical stuff, it's metaphysical stuff. It also assumes stuff like, for example, the principle of non-contradiction, various kinds of logical laws, the law of the excluded middle. Even notions of like what a circle is. Can you have a square circle? Inside of our universe, it seems nonsensical to have square circles, but it's not obvious that we can conclude from that it's impossible to have square circles outside the universe. See, sloppy, bad philosophy would just jump to those conclusions. High-quality philosophy doesn't allow oneself to jump to those conclusions, and therefore, really what we have to be is we have to be very honest about not knowing. This brings up my episode called The Power of Not Knowing. Very important episode to be able to do high-quality reasoning and philosophy. So the truth is, and this is the whole problem of proving, the origin of the universe is, in a sense, when we're talking about God, we're talking about the question of what happened before the Big Bang? Where did the Big Bang come from? What caused the Big Bang? And of course, that's a great mystery. We don't know. At least we think we don't know. Maybe some of us do know. Maybe it's just that mainstream culture doesn't know. See, that's also an assumption. See, even the assumption that we don't know what caused the Big Bang, that's an assumption. That's a commonly held assumption, for example, within science, because the way scientists reason about it is like, well, if we did know what caused the Big Bang, then it would just be part of the science curriculum. That's not guaranteed. You don't know that. Maybe some of us do know, but it's not part of the scientific curriculum for important sociological, epistemological, political reasons. Because for something to be part of a scientific curriculum, it has to be accepted by the mainstream of science. Maybe the cause of the Big Bang is so radical that it will not be accepted by mainstream science. You have to consider that possibility. Don't just assume that science will be able to figure out the source of the Big Bang or to accept it. You don't know that. Again, because look, here with science, here's the problem with science, is that people assume that science just applies across the board to everything. But that's an open question. That's an assumption too, because you don't know that. You don't know where science applies to and where it doesn't. Science might apply everywhere inside the universe. It doesn't mean that science applies to what's outside the universe, or the cause and source of the universe. See? Because that boundary between inside versus outside the universe, that's a very significant boundary. So moving on to the next step of this argument is there cannot be an infinite chain of causes. That's also a problematic proposition. Why not? Why can't there be an infinite chain of causes? Why can't it be that that's what the universe is? It's just an infinite chain of causes. Of course, you see the problem here, though, is, well, I don't know if it's a problem. Whether it's a problem or not really depends about whether you want God to exist or not. People have different opinions about that. Do you want God to exist? You answer that for yourself. But if you have an infinite chain of causes, could that entire chain then be what God is an infinite chain of causes? After all, one of the important characteristics of God, from that definition we stated earlier, is it's infinite. If God is infinite, then we're looking around for God. We don't see God anywhere, but what we see is an infinite chain of causes. So maybe that's God. Ta-da! You want to be open to that possibility too. Now you say, well, but it's nonsensical to have an infinite chain of causes. Surely it has to stop somewhere. Why? Why does it have to stop somewhere? Well, Leo, because everything in our ordinary world, everything has like a cause that we can track, and it's all kind of like finite, and we can kind of tell where stuff stops and ends. You have to be very careful about, remember that we're chimpanzees basically on this spinning ball of Earth. And we look at the world and reality from a certain very narrow band of scale, not the micro scale and not the cosmological scale. We're somewhere in between. And our intuitions are tuned so that we survive in this, narrow band that chimpanzees survive in. We don't have good intuitions about the quantum scale and how stuff works there. We've already discovered in the last 100 years that the quantum phenomenon is very weird, spooky, nonsensical, to kind of like to wrap your mind around and actually to model it. We have good mathematics for predicting how stuff behaves at those scales, but we don't really have a good picture of what's really going on, like in a sort of an intuitive physical sense. We don't really even have a good understanding of what a photon is or what an electron is. So, but it's the same thing, is that we shouldn't expect our intuitions to work outside of the range that they evolved in. Our intuitions might be very wrong about the quantum scale, and they might be very wrong about the ultimate cosmological scale, which is what we're talking about here, the cosmological argument, the Big Bang. Whether human intuitions apply to the very most fundamental aspects of existence, this infinite chain of causes, maybe that's where our intuitions just break down, but nevertheless, an infinite chain of causes exists. And maybe we're in it right now. Maybe this is the infinite chain of causes. Now, of course, the problem with that is that you might say, well, okay, fine, but Leo, why should we call it God? It's an infinite chain of causes, but it's a material chain of causes. It's a naturalistic chain of causes. No need to bring God into this whole thing. And we don't really see the kind of like spiritual qualities of God in this infinite chain. We don't see the love, we don't see the intelligence, we don't see the omnipotence, we don't see the omniscience, we don't see some of these other qualities. And that's a fair point. And you're going to see this in many of these arguments, is that even if the argument proves some version of God, it doesn't usually prove the version of God, sort of the maximalist version of God that a theist would want. And usually what ends up being proved is something like, well, very, very simple. So let's move on to the next step in this argument, which is that the cause of the universe cannot come from inside the universe, so it must come from outside the universe. How plausible is that? Well, you have to also consider the possibility here is, why couldn't the universe just exist by itself or have caused itself? What if the universe is its own cause? Now you might say, well, Leo, that's impossible because logic tells us and our experience tells us that nothing inside the universe can be its own cause. It's always caused by some other thing, which is why we have this infinite chain of causes. That's true, but again, that's only on the interior of the universe. If we're talking about beyond the universe, what caused the universe, maybe it's possible that the universe created itself. That's an interesting possibility. We shouldn't dismiss that. And then it's interesting because if the universe created itself, well, what does it mean to create oneself? If there's an object that can create oneself, might that be what God is a self-creating object? Sounds like a plausible candidate for God. But again, this self-creation notion is a very loaded notion. What does self-creation really mean? Did the sun create itself? Did the earth create itself? Did life create itself? What does that mean? Did space-time create itself? That's some heavy stuff that we don't have time to answer here, so we're going to keep going. I'm just kind of getting your mind, start thinking metaphysically, existentially here. And so the final step of this argument is that the cause must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, very powerful, absolutely simple, and not dependent on parts, which need other causes. Okay, so what can we say about this point? Timeless, spaceless, immaterial, yes, almost by definition timeless and spaceless, because we're defining time and space as the universe. So if we're talking about something beyond or outside the universe, then almost by definition it would have to be timeless and spaceless. Now, whether it's immaterial or not, that's it's tricky because it's all about how we define our terms. Is what's outside the universe immaterial or material? How would we know that? We should be open to both possibilities. We don't really know. Is it powerful? In a certain sense, yes, because it created the universe. So it's quite powerful. Is it absolutely simple? Again, this isn't obvious. It's not obvious that it is absolutely simple. And even if it is absolutely simple, this is actually kind of against the point of the theists, because the theists want to claim something more than just absolute simplicity for God. When a theist believes in God, prays to God, the theist is not praying to some sort of simple, I don't know, what would you call it? A void? I mean, like, what is absolute simplicity? That's not made of parts. The only thing that could be is like a pure void, a pure formless void. So, first of all, we have to be open to the possibility that God is just a pure, formless void. Maybe that's what God is. Okay, that's an interesting possibility. But then the scientist types will say, well, but then if it's an empty void, that's not a problem for science. I mean, science will accept that. The universe appeared out of a void. Okay, we can accept that because a void is a kind of a scientific notion. Nothing mystical and woo-woo about it. Nothing supernatural about a void. And why call a void God? It seems like you're changing the goalposts here, and you're just trying to smuggle God into any place you can. That's how a scientist would look at this situation. That's a fair argument, I would say. Because it's not obvious at all how a simple void. First of all, how does that help us explain the universe? It doesn't. It almost doesn't help us at all. And also, it doesn't seem to fit the definition of God. How is a void intelligent? How is a void loving? How is a void this all-powerful supreme being that has these godly qualities to it? It's just a fucking void. Just a blank canvas. Okay. That's just materialism, right? So how is God different from materialism then? So ultimately, what do we make of this cosmological argument? It's not very convincing. It's not very convincing because it makes all these assumptions about how the outside of the universe should be and how it should work. And it assumes that all of this normal human intuitive logic that we use to understand the everyday physical world, that's going to apply to the origin of existence, to where the physical laws came from and so forth. And that's just, you can't make that kind of leap. Logic can't help you understand that because you don't know even if logic exists outside the universe. That's a very profound question. Is logic something that's part of the universe? Is it part of even something smaller, like just the human psyche? Maybe even the universe is not strictly logical. It's just that the human psyche imposes and projects its logical schemes onto the universe in a sort of a Kantian sense. Maybe it's like that. Maybe logic is part of like the structure of the brain more than it is the universe itself. It's entirely non-trivial to answer that question. So you can't just assume that. So that's the cosmological argument. Post down below how effective you think that is. Now let's move on. Another argument here, which is kind of related to the cosmological one, is like this. It's the argument from the Big Bang. It goes like this. A lot of Christians make this argument. They say that, of course, in the Bible, it says that God created the earth and in a sense, the whole world, and by world is meant the whole universe. So there was a clear creation event. And science tells us that the Big Bang seems to be that creation event. Everything can be projected backwards to the Big Bang. And so the Big Bang matches how the Bible says God created the universe in a single event. And so the Christians want to say that science proves that the universe then is not eternal and that it has a beginning, which implies that creation event. And therefore, the cause of this creation event of the Big Bang must be some timeless, spaceless, immaterial, very powerful thing, which we call God. That's the whole argument. How convincing is it? Well, let's take a look. The first problem here is even assuming the Big Bang. Don't forget that even the Big Bang is an assumption. We don't really know if it's even true that the Big Bang occurred. It seems that the universe is expanding, but that's only based on our current best science. And science changes over time. Future generations, maybe in 500 years, scientists will change their minds and create some new models, some new understanding of quantum mechanics and general relativity, some new synthesis and grand theory of everything, which changes how we understand dark matter and dark energy and all this kind of stuff. And then we realize that the universe maybe is not expanding the way we thought it was, or the inflation didn't happen how we expected. And because to get the Big Bang, you have to make assumptions as well. And we don't know all those assumptions. So here's actually a problem for Christians and theists. If you're a Christian and you want to use this Big Bang argument, here's the problem. Do you really want to hinge your belief in God on the validity of the Big Bang? Because what happens if tomorrow scientists come out and say, guys, we were wrong. Science gets it wrong sometimes. We were wrong. And we realized the Big Bang didn't actually happen. So does this now mean that God doesn't exist? See, if you're a Christian, you have to be very careful. You have to be honest about how you make these arguments. Because if you really are hinging your belief on this argument, then you're going to have to change your mind about the existence of God. Now, of course, the problem is that Christians don't do that. They're using these arguments as rationalizations, not as actually to come to knowledge of God. It's just a rationalization, a backwards rationalization. So there's a difference between those. So that's one problem here. Another problem here is, of course, that to make this argument, you have to believe in the Bible. You have to believe the Bible is true, accurate. That's not obvious. You can't assume that. The Bible could be full of self-deception. How do you know? So that's an obvious problem. The next one is the next step in this argument is that science proves that the universe is not eternal and that it had a beginning. That's also a bit of a leap, because first of all, just because the Big Bang happened does not mean that the universe is not eternal. For example, the Big Bang could have just been a contraction of the previous universe. And so maybe what the universe is doing is it's just sort of expanding and contracting on itself over billions and trillions of years. It's doing this expansion and contraction, but it's just one object doing this, expanding, blowing up and contracting and crunching down. That could be the case, in which case it's doing that eternally. So you can't just assume that the Big Bang means the universe is not eternal, or that it had a beginning. Also, you can't assume that the Big Bang was the beginning of everything. Maybe the Big Bang is just a part of something much larger, and then you have an infinite chain of eternal stuff beyond the Big Bang. And then, which brings us to the final part of this argument, is that so the cause of this Big Bang must be God. Again, that's a leap. You can't make that leap, because maybe the cause is some sort of intergalactic alien or interuniversal alien. Or maybe it's some kind of demon. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a material object. Maybe it's a transmaterial cause. You can't assume that it's God. You can't assume that it's loving and intelligent and all this kind of stuff. Why would you make that assumption? Just because the Bible tells you so? But you can't trust the Bible. If you're really going to do serious philosophy, serious metaphysics, serious epistemology, you can't just take the word of any human as to what the nature of reality is. You have to actually sit down and figure it out through some kind of logical, empirical inquiry, not by hearsay and beliefs from other people, because any person can be wrong. Even with good intentions, they can be wrong. And never even mind the people with bad intentions who want to fool you with religion. Plenty of those around as well. The next argument is this, the something from nothing argument, which basically says that something cannot come from nothing. Anything that created the universe had to be more powerful than the universe itself. What are we to make of this argument? Again, it's very non-obvious that something can't come from nothing. Now, in our ordinary world, inside the universe, it seems like something can't come from nothing, and it never does. Something always comes from something. But the universe itself might be a distinctly different kind of phenomenon, which does come from nothing. And also for the theists, it's usually theists who make this argument that something can't come from nothing, so it must come from God. That's the gist of this argument. Well, here's something I want to warn you about, you theists, is this. Why are you assuming that God is not nothing? What if the very something that creates everything is nothing? And then that's your God. See, that's not very satisfying to Christian theists because they want to have a personal connection with God. But what if God is not something that you have a personal connection with? Maybe that's just your needs, your ego's needs, and really God is truly nothing, and you're not going to have a personal connection with it. Or maybe you can have a personal connection with this nothing, but this nothing, to have a personal connection with it requires something other than the sort of Christian stuff that you're doing. Yeah, it's just the problem here is that these questions about can something come from nothing, can something be uncaused, does everything need to be an infinite chain of causation? These are such fundamental questions that you see we don't have reference for it in our everyday life and world. So we don't even know how to think about these properly because they're not grounded in anything. The way that we figure out how the world works is that we actually look at how it works. And we're looking at the stuff that's local to us. It's hard for us to look very far beyond the universe to see how stuff really works. So we just don't have the vantage point. We don't have the empirical data that we need to really answer these questions. That's the problem here. And a lot of and people who find any of these arguments convincing are ultimately what you'll find is that they're question begging. And you can do question begging from the religious theistic point of view, or you can do question begging from the scientific skeptic materialist atheist point of view. Both can engage in question begging. Question begging is basically when you assume the conclusion. For example, it's question begging to say that something can't come from nothing, because the real issue here is that we have a question here. This should be framed as a question. Can something come from nothing? That's an empirical question. Don't tell us that it can't. Frame it as a question in your own mind. You see, because if you're telling us it can't, you're already assuming you know the answer without ever having asked the question. And this is a much more profound question than you would think. People want to skip over as though these are obvious answers to obvious questions. It's not obvious at all. All right, let's move on to something new. The ontological argument. First step in this argument is we can imagine the concept of a perfect, all-powerful, infinite being. Second step, but a perfect being that lacks existence and only exists as a concept in our imagination is not perfect because it's lacking something. Namely, it's lacking existence. So, this perfect being must actually exist just by virtue of the fact that it's perfect. Perfection implies existence. So the very idea of perfection requires existence. That's the ontological argument. How convinced are you that God exists from that argument? I would say if I heard this argument, I would not be very convinced. In fact, I did hear this argument. I heard this argument back in my university days when I was studying Descartes and so forth. I was never very convinced by this argument. It seems kind of absurd. So let's break it down and see why it doesn't seem to work. Okay, so we can imagine the concept of a perfect, all-powerful, infinite being. Okay, that's true. We can do that. Imagine one right now. All right, so you got the picture of God in your mind. Okay, but then how do we go from that to knowing it actually is real and that we're not deluding ourselves? So obviously, the next step in the argument is that a perfect being that lacks existence is not perfect because it's lacking something. We can grant that. I think that's pretty plausible. A perfect being. I mean, still you're making an assumption there, like perfection requires existence. Is that true? How do you know that's true? If you want to be really skeptical, and I tend to want to be, I'm not even willing to grant that, honestly. Yeah, it's not obvious that perfection requires existence. Why can't non-existence be perfection? I mean, aren't you biased? We all exist, so of course we think existence is so good, but maybe non-existence is the better option. Maybe perfection is non-existence. So, we want to be open to that too. That's what radical open-mindedness means. So you can't just assume that. And then to make the next leap is to say that I can imagine this perfection, this perfect being, and then it requires that it must exist, and then that it actually does exist. This just feels so question-begging to me. Like, you have to really want to believe it. Because look, we can also make the argument like, look, I could imagine a intergalactic space kangaroo, a perfect intergalactic space kangaroo. And since it's perfect, it needs to exist. And so therefore, a perfect intergalactic space kangaroo exists. Is that true? I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. You would never make this argument about anything. Obviously, you're making this argument about God only because you need to rationalize that God exists. So yeah, this is not a very convincing argument. I've made a better formulation though. It's a little bit more plausible because I was trying to steelman this, and this one it was hard for me to steelman this. So I made a better version of it, which goes like this. This is the better ontological argument. Step 1, imagine the concept of infinity. Step 2, infinity would be unlimited, possessing all possible properties. So when we're talking about infinity, we're imagining an infinite object, an unlimited object. This object must possess all properties and all qualities, because otherwise it would be finite and limited and not infinite. For example, if infinity did not include color in it, then it would lack color, and therefore it would be limited. If infinity didn't include elephants in it, then it would lack the quality of elephantness, and then it would not be infinite, and so on. Okay, so that's the second step. The third step is that existence is a possible property that one could have. And the next step is if infinity does not have existence or actuality, then it cannot be infinite. It must be finite. And then the last step is that therefore God must not only be imaginary, but actual, because God is infinity. So what do you guys think about this argument? Post down below. How would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? So this is a much more convincing argument, but it really hinges on the idea of this concept of infinity. You have to really understand what infinity means. And when I say infinity, I'm not talking about mathematical infinity. I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about something more than that. So it's the sum total of all possible properties. By properties, I mean wet, cold, hot, sharp, soft, round, square, big, small, blue, red, the smell of a skunk. That's what I mean by infinity, all the possible properties. So if you kind of smush them all into one. And then existence is a possible property. Now this is a little bit tricky because if you've studied some serious philosophy, you know that arguments have been made against this kind of argument. And the argument against it is that existence actually is not a property. See, to say that a cat is red or blue or soft or sharp or big or small, these are all properties of an object called a cat. That's plausible. But to say that a cat possesses the property of existence is maybe technically not correct. Maybe existence is such a fundamental thing that it can't even be called a property. Because after all, existence is something that all properties partake in, whether something is red or cold or sharp or a cat or a dog or whatever. It can either exist or not exist. So existence is a possibility for all properties. So maybe it's not right to jump to the conclusion that even if you have an object that has all the possible properties, maybe you can't then jump to the conclusion that it must exist too. So, but see, this is tricky because this now brings in the concept of existence. And this is very tricky because this is the root. We're getting to the root here of metaphysics. What is existence? The problem is that you don't know. You don't know what existence is. Nobody knows. If you knew what existence is, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You would. Well, I don't want to spoil it for you. Yeah, I don't want to spoil it for you. I know what existence is, so I'm holding back. I'm trying not to tell you, because I want to like go through it as a newbie, right? I don't want to just give you the answers. I want to help you to see the thought process that I went through to get the answers, and then what it means to think well and what it means to think poorly. So we can't assume these things. So if we're coming from a position of ignorance, we don't know what existence is. Existence is a very mysterious, very fundamental thing, and we should be very careful about assuming stuff about existence. Whether existence is necessary or contingent, not obvious what that means. It's also not obvious what the relationship is between existence and non-existence. That's also extremely non-obvious. Does non-existence exist? And if it doesn't exist, then there's no non-existence? It gets very strange loopy here. Can existence not exist? You see, that's kind of stuff. You get into weird paradoxes. And that's not a mistake. It should be that way. But anyways, I'm not going to explain to you what existence is here. That's beyond the scope of this conversation. But let's go on to the next step of this argument, which is that if infinity does not possess existence, then it's not infinite. And this means that infinity must exist because infinity possesses all properties. Is that true? How plausible is that? I mean, you could kind of believe it, but it's not very like, it's just so speculative, you know, it's so conceptual. We have to be very open to the possibility of self-deception. What if we're just imagining this concept of infinity, of all possible properties blending together, but then that's just like in our imagination, and then in the real world, it doesn't work that way. I mean, after all, what do we know in the real world that is an amalgamation of all possible properties in one? In fact, you might think this is impossible because, Leo, how can it seems logically incoherent to talk about an object that is both red and blue and sharp and not sharp and a cat and a dog and an elephant and a not an elephant and all of this together. It seems, and it exists and it doesn't exist. It seems like this is just a fantasy, incoherent thing. Like we could talk about triangles with four sides, and we're just talking nonsense. That doesn't mean that there are these magical triangles with four sides in the real world. It just means that we're confused. It's not even at the level of being true or false. It's just meaningless. There's that third category of just meaningless nonsense. Triangles with four sides. Maybe infinity is just a triangle with four sides. And we can't conclude that therefore it actually exists. It could just be a concept. How do we know that any of our concepts have to correspond with the physical, empirical reality? That's not obvious. And in fact, our everyday experience tells us that we have many, many objects and concepts in our minds that correspond to nothing in the real world. Unicorns and four-sided triangles and so on. You can think of more. So this ontological argument, in the end, not that convincing. Especially if you don't have a deep understanding of what infinity is. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. I remember I talked about layers. So on the surface, we've just been talking about the surface layer. The surface layers to these ontological arguments are not very convincing. But once you have an actual experience of infinity, if you realize infinity, and infinity is real, once you have an experience of infinity, then these actual ontological arguments will be much more convincing to you, and you will actually see that there's something profound in these arguments. It's not just a coincidence that these arguments exist. They exist for some good reasons. because they do point to something. They point to infinity, the nature of infinity. But that's in retrospect. In retrospect. You can't get to infinity from these arguments. That's a problem. That's why it's not convincing, because you have to already have experienced infinity to be convinced by these arguments. In a sense, these arguments will only prove God to those who already have experienced God. So it's kind of tautological and preaching to the choir. Preaching to the choir. Of course, that's the whole problem with God, is that those who understand it don't need to be told about it, and those who don't understand it, no matter how much you tell them about it, they won't understand it. So then why are we talking about it? Well, we're talking about it because there is value in the epistemology and the metaphysics, and to look at how our minds think about these questions. There is value in that. That's the value. The next argument is Descartes' causal argument. It goes like this. I have an idea of a perfect infinite being. This idea must have a cause. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It has a cause. That's step 2. Step 3 is the effect, an effect cannot contain more reality than its cause. This is a really interesting twist. So Descartes' causal argument is similar to the ontological arguments, but it's got this interesting twist to it here. So think about this. An effect cannot contain more reality than its cause. We'll get back to that. The next step in the argument is that my idea of an infinite perfect being contains more reality than myself because I'm a finite imperfect being. The next step is, therefore, only an actual infinite perfect being could be the cause of this idea in me. Therefore, God exists. That's the whole argument. How convinced are you that God exists from that argument? It's very tricky. Let's go through it step by step because, okay, so where does this fall apart? I have an idea of a perfect infinite being. Okay, I got one. Okay, I can do that. Okay, step 2, this idea must have a cause. Okay, yes, it has a cause, like my brain caused it, we might say, scientifically. Or the cause might be that I read it in the Bible. I read the Bible and it caused me to have this idea. Or the cause is that I listened to a video of Leo talking about it. Okay, so the cause is that Leo was speaking these words that went into my ears, into my ear holes, and then caused some neurons and chemicals, and now I have this idea. Okay, so there's the cause. Okay, so next step. An effect cannot contain more reality than its cause. What the hell does that mean? That's not obvious if that's true. An effect cannot contain more reality. Well, maybe they all contain the same level of... This assumes that there's more and less reality to various causes and effects. But it's not obvious that it works that way. Do we have multiple levels of reality, or is there just one reality? What does it mean to say that one cause is more has more reality than some other cause? That's very shaky footing. So the next step is that my idea of an infinite perfect being contains more reality than me because I'm a finite imperfect being. Man, that's such a fucking leap. Descartes, you're killing me here, Descartes. Why you make this leap? Because here's the problem. The materialist will want to argue that actually it's the opposite. This idea, this concept of this concept of a perfect being, God, it's just a concept. And that the actual brain that is causing this concept has more reality than the concept, in the same way that the brain is more real than a unicorn. We can imagine a unicorn. That doesn't mean that the image of the unicorn in our minds was caused by an even realer unicorn in the real world, because it could have been caused by our brain. And so the next step is that, therefore, only an actual infinite perfect being could have been the cause of this idea. Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. Also, notice this assumes that you, me, The imperfect being, finite being, is separate from God, the infinite perfect being. Conventionally speaking, that's how it seems, but we also have to be so careful not to assume that I'm not God. Maybe you are God. Maybe there's no difference between me and God. We can't assume that either. Maybe the reason I'm having this idea of God is because I am God. Maybe that. How do we know that's not true? See, we have to be open-minded. So, in conclusion, yeah, very, very unconvincing. This will not convince any skeptic, I don't think, or a materialist. However, that's on the surface level. If you go on a deeper, more subtle level, which is going to be retroactive after you realize infinity, you look back on Descartes' argument, you'll actually realize there's something to it here. The problem is that it just doesn't work going forwards. It works going backwards because it's so not obvious. And you need the empirical proof at the very end of the tunnel to see that the tunnel leads somewhere other than a dead end. And that it's just not obvious. I remember studying this argument back in my university days when I was studying philosophy, and I was a skeptic and an atheist back then. I was not convinced at all by this argument. And I had to steelman this argument to pass exams in university and so forth. And I would steelman it, but my heart wasn't in it because it didn't convince me. The next argument is called the teleological argument, and it goes like this. It's pretty simple. It's not very logical. It's more an appeal to an intuition. And it goes like this. Step one is that the complexity, harmony, and intelligent order of nature suggests an intelligent designer. This order resembles that of man-made intelligent objects. So there's a kind of intelligence that man puts into creating his artifacts. A kind of obvious intelligence. And so by analogy, by sort of a parallelism, the argument goes that if you look carefully around at the complexity and harmony of nature, you're going to see a profound intelligence. And not just in life, but even in the inanimate objects like stars, planets, gravitation, the sun, the way light works, the relativistic nature of light. It's just, and see, there's multiple levels to this teleological argument, because on the surface, when you say that God must exist because everything appears so intelligently designed, as if it was designed, of course, the scientist, materialist, atheist will come in here and say, well, what the fuck are you talking about? It's not really designed. It just appears that way because that's how evolution works. And we already know evolution. We've scientifically validated evolution through natural selection. We know the whole mechanism. We understand all that. We already know that you can get very complex things that look like design through random mutation and through natural selection and billions of years of evolution, millions of years of selection. You can get the eyeball, you can get wings on birds. They have evolved, co-evolved. There's been convergent evolution multiple times throughout history. Eyeballs have evolved, wings have evolved in different animals, from birds to bats and so forth. And you see this all throughout the biological sciences. So it can seem, if you study a lot of science and evolution and biology the way that I have, this argument is a very sort of topsy-turvy, like roller coaster. First, you start out thinking that, well, you can start in different places, depending on where you start. You can start believing it or not believing it, but you can start, let's say, believing that reality was not intelligently designed. Let's say you start there. Then you start to study like actual molecular biology, and you start to study the mechanisms of how DNA works. It's mind-bogglingly intelligent when you start to study that. So you're kind of shocked by its beauty and order and harmony, how all the little molecules, trillions of cells, all work together perfectly to create your immune system and cell biology and all this sort of stuff. And it seems, the more you study it, the more intelligent it seems. So that sort of starts to make the argument seem a little bit more plausible, that maybe God did design all this stuff. It's pretty crazy how all this stuff just came together accidentally. Really? Accidentally, all this stuff? That's kind of far-fetched. But then you start to study the actual mechanisms of natural selection, and you start to realize, wait a minute. Billions of years. I'm thinking on time, humans, we think of time scales of days and weeks. But here we're talking about billions and millions of years. We have a very extensive fossil record of how animals have clearly evolved from more primitive forms to more advanced forms, and not the other way around. And we even have examples of how dog breeds have been artificially selected by man, and just within 100 or 200 years, you can have new dog breeds just by selecting certain kinds of dogs over and over and over again, certain traits within dogs. You can domesticate animals this way. You can domesticate foxes, for example, through this method, just by selecting and only breeding the foxes that are the most friendly to humans. After just a few dozen generations, you can have nearly domesticated foxes. That exists today. You can find videos on YouTube of these foxes. They're not quite as domesticated as a dog or a cat, but it's pretty impressive how far they get with just a few generations, So that seems like pretty good evidence. And we can even see mutations and evolution happen within viruses, within bacteria, and so forth. So isn't that the final nail in the coffin? Doesn't that mean that everything is just evolution and that there's no need for a God anymore? Well, not so fast. Again, there's deeper layers to this. You can reach that point. But then there's an even deeper level where, first of all, there's an assumption here, which is that God and evolution are mutually exclusive, that you either have one or the other. To think that way, you have to sort of think that, well, God was just a human invention designed to explain away where life came from before we understood how life really came about, which is just through natural selection and evolution. And once Darwin figured that out, and we did a little bit more work to cross all the T's and dot all the I's, once we did all that, 100 years after Darwin, now everything is very clear. There's not much mystery left. There's a little bit of mystery as to how life originated, like at the very beginning of the cycle. But other than that, we understand all the natural selection, all that. And so therefore, God is just irrelevant now. We don't need God because we can explain it all naturalistically, materialistically. Yes, but you're still assuming something. You're assuming actually a lot. You're assuming the existence of the entire substrate of reality. You are also assuming the origin of life. We still do not have at all any scientific understanding of how life originated at all. So there's still some gap there that we could stuff God into, God of the gaps. We can do that. And you never know. Atheists make fun of this idea of God of the gaps, but maybe there's a gap where God really will be found. You can't just assume that it will never be found. It's true that you can try to stuff God into all sorts of gaps within science, and that might be silly and wrong, but if there's anywhere that you would plausibly want to stuff God into, it's the gap of the origin of life, because that's a real mystery. Chemically and biologically speaking, that's a huge mystery. We don't know how it happened. It's kind of a miracle if you really look into it, how it happened. Now, is it a literal miracle, or is it just a figurative miracle and that it was just very unlikely, or maybe there's something we don't understand yet and actually it was very likely, but we just don't understand the mechanisms. So those are all possibilities that we don't really know at this point. However, it could be possible that God exists and evolution and natural selection are the means by which God is unfolding. God doesn't have to mean the literal Christian God of God stuck his fingers into molecules and made life out of it. It doesn't have to be that silly and childish. It could be the deistic version of God, which is that God created the universe. God doesn't interact with the universe. God created it and the universe is running, And part of how the universe runs is the physical laws, and ultimately the physical laws just give rise to chemistry, which gives rise to life and to biology. And so that's not contradictory. You have to be open to that possibility. And also you have to be open to the possibility that, again, maybe the universe itself is God. If the universe is God, then physics is God, then chemistry is God, and then biology is God. And natural selection and evolution is God. And so God is creating animals through evolution and natural selection. Now, of course, the atheists and materialists will come back and say, well, yeah, Leo, you can move the goalpost like that and you can redefine God as however you want. I mean, you can define God as mathematics, you can define God as scientific method. And then, but then what are you really achieving? It seems like you're just playing word games, you're not achieving anything. You're not actually helping us understand the world because you're just renaming things to suit your superstitions to try to kind of like save face because you don't have any good arguments and you don't have any good evidence. And that's a fair argument from a certain point of view. So there really is this question of like, if God is the universe, why not just call it the universe? Why even talk about God? And it's not at all obvious from this argument, why call it God? If you want to say that evolution and natural selection are intelligent design, that's literally what intelligent design is, then many scientists and atheists would just accept that. They would just say, yeah, so then what you mean by intelligent design is just evolution. Okay, so what? But you haven't made any headway here. But there's an even deeper level to this argument, which is you start to look not just at the animal life and so forth and evolution, you look at even things that don't seem to evolve, which is, planets and stars and cosmology. You look at the big scale stuff. And this is where now we get into the next argument, which is very closely related, called the fine-tuning argument, which goes like this. Step one is the precise conditions necessary for life in the universe suggest intentional design. All of these constants of physics, the cosmological constant, the force of the, between the electron and the proton and the magnetic force constants and this kind of stuff and the Planck length and all this and the speed of light, all these have to be perfectly balanced to within impossible levels of precision. Otherwise, the universe just wouldn't hold together. We would have a nonsensical universe and no life would be possible. Higher matter couldn't form. Electrons and protons couldn't combine together. You couldn't have more than just hydrogen in the universe. You couldn't have heavier elements. You couldn't have carbon. You couldn't have iron and all this stuff that's necessary for life. And you wouldn't have life. And so therefore God exists. So how convincing is the fine-tuning argument? The fine-tuning argument connects with the teleological argument in the following way, which is that the fine-tuning doesn't just have to apply to life itself. The fine-tuning can apply, and the teleological argument can apply to not just the existence of life or consciousness, but to just even the very fabric of space-time. There's even a sort of a beauty and intelligence and genius if you study quantum mechanics and just Einsteinian physics, just to those equations and how all of that stuff works. It's incredible. The way black holes work, the precision of it and all that. Are we really to believe that happened by accident? That's very implausible. Super, super implausible. Virtually impossible if you just run the numbers as a pure random chance statistical model of getting all these constants and variables just tuned correctly so that this could happen. It's not just unlikely. It's literally impossible. There's not enough. The odds of it are less than there are molecules in the universe. It's like 1 to trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions. It's basically impossible within the time of the universe. Now, of course, you can make counter arguments here with various kinds of fancy, schmancy multiverse theories, and you could say that there's multiverses and we just happen to be in this particular universe because we happen to be conscious and we're alive, so we're already biasing our perspective. There's this anthropocentric bias that we have, so maybe our universe is a very rare universe, but We don't even experience all the broken universes because the broken universes don't have any creatures like us who can look back and reflect on being in the universe. So maybe by this kind of weird loop, the odds are very astronomical, but they're sort of made irrelevant by the fact that we're here and looking backwards on it, retroactively, looking at the odds. So that's sort of the counter argument that an atheist would make. So what are we to make of this? Are these fine-tuning and teleological arguments, are they convincing? Of course, if you want to be strict, they're not convincing. First of all, because they're not even lock-solid logical arguments. This is just, it's probabilistic. At best, these arguments can be probabilistic. You're sort of assuming that it can't happen by random chance, but maybe a universe could just happen by random chance. We're saying it's improbable, but if something is improbable, that doesn't mean it's impossible. So there's that counter argument. So even if at best the teleological argument and fine-tuning argument point towards the possible existence of God, it doesn't guarantee there is a God. It just means that it's possible. Okay, yeah, it's possible, but where does that get us? It doesn't get us anywhere. A lot of things are possible. Maybe it wasn't God. Maybe it was an intergalactic space kangaroo. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's who fine-tuned all this stuff and designed man. Possible? Maybe life on Earth began because some alien species planted it here. Maybe that happened. Of course, that raises the question of where did they come from? Just pushes back the problem, but still. So these arguments, of course, are not very convincing. However, if you go a more advanced, subtle layer, if you come back to these arguments after you realize God, then you'll understand that actually they're correct. These arguments are correct, but you can't know they're correct unless you have an experience of God, unless you understand what God is. That's very difficult to explain because really what's being missed, what scientists are missing, is that they just do not comprehend the genius, the utter fucking genius of the structure of reality. It's way beyond anything any scientist comprehends. And sure, scientists will say, no, Leo, I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, we look up at the stars, it's incredible. There's trillions of stars out there, and all those stars have planets. There's trillions of planets and probably a bunch of weird life and really weird advanced stuff happening out there in the universe. It's mind-boggling. Billions of years we're talking about. We're talking about trillions of molecules just in my own body. Never mind the whole universe. It's staggering. And when you look and study the mechanism of natural selection and evolution and microbiology and DNA and all this, it's like, whoa. That's why I became a scientist. This is something you would hear from Neil deGrasse Tyson. But I'm saying something more advanced, way more advanced than what a Neil deGrasse Tyson understands. What I'm saying is that this you're tapping into a sense of like, wow, existence, right? Fucking existence, wow. You're tapping into that. And that's like, whoa. But you're not understanding how profound that is. Take that sense and scale it up to infinity. And when you do that, then you understand the power of the teleological argument. And it's not this stupid Richard Dawkins kind of argument, the kind of straw man that he makes, which if you were walking through the Sahara Desert and you found a pocket watch laying in the Sahara Desert and you would pick it up and you'd look at it and you say, well, obviously this was made by some intelligence. It didn't just appear here out of the blue. It didn't just evolve. Somebody designed this thing. It's a fucking clock. Look at the intentionality behind its design. And Richard Dawkins would say, well, yeah, but that's a stupid argument because a clock is man-made, but a clock is ultimately, a pocket watch is ultimately in a certain sense, it is the process of evolution. It's question begging, because where did pocket watch come from? It came from the mind of man. And where did the mind of man come from? Well, it came from an evolutionary chain that started from just a bunch of molecules swimming around in some ocean. And so in a sense, the pocket watch is just the intelligent design of the pocket watch. You think that it comes from like this sort of like ethereal, manly quality of intelligence, but really no, it's a process of evolution. That we got clocks and cars and even rocket ships. When you see a rocket ship, if you really think profoundly, holistically about evolution, there's not actually a distinction between a rocket ship and the evolution of a frog and the evolution of microbes. It's all one continuous chain. And so really the intelligence that is in the rocket ship, a rocket ship is very intelligent. It has to be tuned just right. It has this perfect harmony to be able to not blow up and fly where it needs to. Well, that came about through a process. Again, how did we invent rocket ships? Look at the actual process of inventing rocket ships. It wasn't that some genius, godlike human sat down and just drew a rocket ship and it worked. We had 100 years of trial and error, a lot of error. A lot of people got killed making rockets, until we finally evolved to the point through trial and error and natural selection that we selected the right designs by blowing up the bad ones. The bad ones were killed. The dumb human, the human rocketeers and rocket designers who were stupid made bad rockets and killed themselves. And so only the smart ones survived, and then they made the best rockets. That is evolution, Richard Dawkins might say. So what's the mystery? We know how it works. But now I'm going to say there's an even deeper level to that, which Richard Dawkins does not understand, which is that you're taking all of this for granted. You're taking all of this for granted. This doesn't just happen by luck, and it doesn't just happen by natural selection. There's something more profound happening than natural selection. So natural selection is actually I don't want to call it an illusion. It's a red herring. Natural selection exists, and it's a powerful force, and it's important. But if you think that you can explain the intelligent design of this universe, of this fabric of existence, through natural selection, you are a fucking fool, because you're blind to the staggering intelligence that is running this whole show. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You're completely underestimating the nature of reality. The problem, though, is that me telling you that isn't going to change your mind. That requires an awakening. You need an awakening to see that. That's hard to come by. All right, let's move on to the next argument, which is Aristotle's proof from movement. This is a bit more complex. There's many steps to this argument, so let's go through them. The first step is everything in the universe moves and changes. Okay, we can buy that. Next step, every moved thing is moved by some other thing. Next step is this creates a chain of movers. Next step, this chain cannot be extended infinitely far back. We've seen this before. Next step is an infinite regress would leave an entire chain unexplained. Okay. Next step, so there must be a first cause of motion. Next step, the first cause must be itself unmoved, otherwise it would require a mover and it would be part of this infinite chain. So to terminate the chain, we need to come to something that is not moved, but that causes movement. And then the next step says that this unmoved mover must be eternal, otherwise something would have to have brought it into existence. And then the attributes of this unmoved mover are that it must be immaterial, eternal, necessary, and perfect. And then Aristotle makes some other claims about what this unmoved mover is like and how it causes, for example, motion. He doesn't really make an argument for it so much as just to say this is how it is that it doesn't work through physical contact. So you might wonder, how does the unmoved mover create motion. Aristotle says not by physical contact, it moves things as an object of desire or love. The cosmos is drawn towards perfection, towards the perfection of the unmoved mover. And it produces motion by being loved. Now this, how convincing is this argument? That's the whole argument. How convincing is this? There, especially towards the end here, you have a lot of these, claims about love. How can you make any scientific sense of this? How can you make any rational sense of this? What does it mean to say that there's an unmoved mover that moves things towards love? What? What does this even mean? Let's go back to the beginning of the whole argument, of the whole proof here, and just kind of go through it step by step. So everything in the universe moves and changes. Is that true? Yes. Next step, every moved thing is moved by some other thing. Is that true? Within the universe, I'm inclined to say yes, that's true. That's how science says things works. This creates a chain of movers. Is that true? Yes. Next step is the chain cannot extend infinitely far back. Again, that's not obvious. We can't assume that. Maybe it can. I don't know why Aristotle assumes it can't. He says that an infinite regress would leave the entire chain unexplained. Maybe it does leave it unexplained, but you can't assume that the ultimate source of existence should have an explanation. So you have to appreciate that explanation could be something that applies to stuff within existence, but not the source of existence. So why can't there just be an infinite chain of movers stretching as far back, eternally far back, infinitely far back, and then that's it? And then you don't need to explain anything else. That's just the structure of the universe. Why can't it be like that? Aristotle doesn't really give us a good reason why it can't be that way. Also, why can't you have a universe that's shaped like a circle, just a loop? So you have an infinite circle, a chain of causes that all circle back to each other. Why can't you have that? Aristotle doesn't explain that possibility. So he says there must be a first mover, which is unmoved. But this is problematic because how the hell does an unmoved thing create movement? This is equally as mysterious and implausible as an infinite chain of movers. Maybe even more implausible, especially once you start to bring in notions of love into this thing. How does love move anything from non-movement? I mean, it's very weird how that would work. No explanation for the mechanism or anything like that. And he says that this unmoved mover must be eternal, implying that it's God. But if the unmoved mover can be eternal, why can't an infinite chain of causes, movers, itself also be eternal? That's not really explained very well. And then what are we to make of this unmoved mover? What is it that we're actually meaning when we say an unmoved mover? What is that? It seems like it can't be a material object, and Aristotle in fact says it can't. So then again, we're kind of led to this conclusion that it's just this very simple object with no parts to it, no cause and effect within it. So it's like an empty void. Is that what Aristotle means by the unmoved mover? It's just an empty void? Okay, well then scientists can accept an empty void. That's materialism. A bunch of matter happening inside an empty void. So then why are we talking about God? How does this prove a God? It just proves an empty void. And then it doesn't prove love either. So in the end, not very convincing. Next proof is St. Augustine's proof number 1. There's going to be a second one here. So his first proof is this. Step number 1 is that certain truths like math and logic are eternal, unchanging, and necessary. Next step, these truths transcend individual minds and physical reality. They are not created, they are discovered. Next step, eternal truths cannot exist independently or in a void. They must be grounded in something equally eternal and unchanging. And then the next step, these eternal truths cannot be grounded in a material world since it is always changing. and these truths are unchanging. Next step, the foundation for all truth must be God. Because God is the only unchanging eternal thing. God must not be merely truthful, but truth itself. And St. Augustine has this beautiful quote which says, quote, "If truth were to perish, it would still be true that truth perished," end quote. So this is a sort of an argument of equating God with truth, and then connecting this with logical and mathematical truths, since they seem to be necessary and almost like absolutes. For example, something as very simple, the very basics of logic is like the law of non-contradiction. A equals A, the law of identity. This kind of stuff, St. Augustine would want to say is basically God. These truths rest in God, because these truths, where are they found? Where do you find these truths? You don't find them out in nature. You don't find mathematics out in nature. So what are we to make of this proof? Let's go through some of these steps here. So he says certain truths like math and logic are eternal, unchanging, and necessary. This is already difficult, because what are we to make of math and logic, the truths of math and logic, so-called? Are we supposed to think that these are out there in the universe somewhere, beyond the universe? Or are these residing inside the mechanism and structure of the human brain? Maybe logic and math is just how human psychology and neurology works. That's not obvious to say. What is the nature of math and logic and its truthfulness? These are extremely challenging questions that mankind has been trying to answer for thousands of years, and we don't have very good answers as to the nature of why math is true. And is math true in all possible worlds and universes, or only in this one? Can we have a multiverse with other universes that have different kind of math and logic? Again, that's not very obvious what the answer to that is. So I wouldn't want to speculate. It would be most accurate to say we don't know. The next point of this proof is that these truths transcend individual minds and physical reality, and they're not created but discovered. Again, that's not obvious. Do these truths transcend physical reality? Does math transcend physical reality? Or is math like somehow baked into and something we extract out of physical reality? You know, we see one cat and we say that's one cat, and we see another two dogs and we say that's two dogs, and then we add them together and we get three because we can add them empirically in the real world. Maybe there's nothing more to math than just that. The empirical, physical laws of the universe. Why are we assuming that math somehow transcends physics? Maybe it doesn't. It's not entirely obvious. He says math and logic transcend individual minds. Does it really? I don't know. Not obvious either. Then Augustine says that eternal truths cannot exist independently or in a void. They must be grounded in something, unchanging. This I find very puzzling, because a void is eternal and unchanging. So why wouldn't you want to ground math and logic into a void? And yet he somehow doesn't want to do that. But he also doesn't want to ground it into a material world, because he says the material world is always changing. Well, it's hard to imagine anything other than either a material world that's always changing, or you have something that isn't changing and it's very simple. It's just a void. I mean, like, what is the third alternative here? And then if he doesn't want to put it into a void, and he doesn't want to put it into the changing material world, like, what's the middle ground? That's not obvious. So to me, this one is not very convincing. He has a second proof. This is St. Augustine's proof number 2, which I call hierarchy of goodness. It goes like this. Step 1, we recognize degrees of goodness in the world. You can have very good people, moderately good people, evil people, and so on. And it doesn't just have to be people. It can be things too, objects, different objects. You can have a very good car, a mediocre car, and an awful car. Right? You can have various degrees of beauty, for example, too. So the next step is that he says that this implies a standard of perfect goodness. Because if you can imagine different degrees of goodness from the lowest towards the highest, what's the highest? Well, it's going to be perfection, perfect goodness. Then he says that this perfect good must exist and not just as an idea, and that the perfect good is what we call God. He says, quote, God is that than which nothing better can be conceived, end quote. So that's the whole proof. What are we to make of this? Is it true that there are degrees of goodness? Yes. Although we could even question that because we might say, well, what is goodness? Isn't goodness just something we constructed and that we're projecting? It's a mental construct. Maybe goodness is a social construct. Maybe in the world without humans, there is no degrees of goodness. So already right there, there's a problem with his argument. But let's grant him that we recognize different degrees of goodness. Okay, so then the next step is it implies that there's a scale of different goodnesses that goes all the way up to infinity, to perfection. This is also problematic because what does it even mean to say that something is perfectly good? Is there such a thing as a perfectly good car? Isn't that relative and that depends on like what its purposes are? Like, you can't just say that there's a perfectly good car because you need to know like what you're going to use the car for. Because there can be a perfectly good, for example, minivan for shuttling 5 of your children to school back and forth, but then that minivan is not very good at drag racing. And conversely, you can have a car that's great at drag racing, but terrible for driving your kids to school. So what does it mean to have a perfectly good car? And then couldn't we scale this idea of, couldn't we relativize this notion of goodness and say that basically for anything to be good, we have to know who it's good for and for what purposes. Nothing is just good in pure abstraction. It has to be good for some purpose. And that purpose depends on who's using it. Depends on some kind of ego. So already this calls into question whether we can have this perfectly good Platonic thing that St. Augustine wants there to be. But let's say we grant him that there even is the concept of a perfect goodness in abstraction. Okay, so there is that thing. But then he jumps to the next step, which is the perfect good must exist, not just as an idea, because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be good. This is a very sneaky, it's sneaky. It's very sneaky. There's a very clever argument. Because look, if something, imagine that it's possible for something perfectly good to exist, but it doesn't exist. That would be bad, we would say, right? That's not good. The question, though, is, can you go from that to concluding that it does exist, that it must exist? Just because it can, but if it doesn't, that it's bad, does that mean that it should exist? That's not, to me, that's not obvious at all. I mean, why can't there be the possibility of perfect good? We grant that it's possible, and I don't just mean it as a concept. I mean, let's grant that it's physically possible for there to be a universe that's perfectly good. And we can even go further and grant that, and if it doesn't exist in actuality, that's bad. Okay, but then why can't we just have a bad universe? If you're truly honest and open, you should be open to that possibility. Why can't we just have an evil universe? St. Augustine doesn't really address that. Okay, now we have a slightly different version of this argument, which is the argument from participation. It goes like this. Step 1, things exhibit qualities like unity, beauty, goodness, perfection, intelligence, and consciousness to various degrees. Step 2, if something has an attribute by degree, it possesses it by participation, and this degree can be scaled up infinitely. So, you understand what that means? In a sense, what this is saying is that, for example, if anything in the universe has the quality of it being intelligent, we can say a human is intelligent relative to a rat. Most would agree. So if a human is more intelligent than a rat, and we could say it, and a rat has some intelligence too. A rat can navigate a maze, and there are smarter rats and dumber rats. So there's different scales even of rat intelligence. And a rat is more intelligent than a cockroach. Okay, we can grant that. But then that means there must be something more intelligent than a human, maybe an AI. And then maybe something more intelligent than that, it scaled up infinitely, we got God. But what this argument is really trying to get at, it's something very profound. It's the idea that in order for any quality to exist, in any degree, it has to derive that quality from participation in the sum total of the universe. That's what is really being said here. Now, that's a very interesting, clever, and profound metaphysical idea. The question is it true? We don't know. So the next step in the argument says that because things can only exist by participation in the whole universe, there must exist a higher nth degree from which all of these attributes originate. And that would be God. Now, how convincing is this argument to you? That's the whole argument. Are you convinced that God exists? Well, you see the problem here. The problem is that, of course, it's easy to grant the first premise or step of the argument, which is that, of course, there's various degrees of qualities of things in the universe. That's easy to grant. But then the next step is very not obvious, which is the notion that to have any attribute, that attribute can only come to you by participation in something higher which possesses all the attributes to an nth degree more or less. Well, exactly, actually, to an nth degree. So in a sense, what this argument is saying is that reality works not bottom up the way that materialist science says, but actually top down. It's not that you have a bunch of dumb molecules bouncing around and then they come together over billions of years and then they produce something intelligent. And then you get the first intelligent thing, and then that thing produces more intelligent things and more intelligent things and scales up intelligence that way. That's not, this is the sort of inverse of that. What this is saying is that if anything exists in the universe and has intelligence, it's because it's deriving its intelligence from the universe itself as a whole. This is a holistic top-down sort of model of the universe. What evidence do we have that the universe actually works this way? It's not obvious at all, especially if all you're doing is empirical science. It seems to actually work the opposite way, is that everything, by reductionism, everything reduces down to molecules and all you have is molecules. And from that, it seems like more complex stuff takes time to evolve. At the beginning of the universe, 14 billion years ago, you just had a bunch of hydrogen atoms and nothing else. And then it took a long time for something more complex, even for like gold atoms to form. It took a long, long time. So what do we do to make of this? Like, gold? Are we to say that gold, you can have different degrees of gold and then gold derives from some sort of higher, ultimate, infinite gold? Not really clear how that works. However, that's on the surface level. there's a deeper layer, once you have some awakening, there's a deeper layer where you will start to appreciate this argument a little bit more. In that, in a certain sense, like, look, you understand that you're not just a creature inside the universe. You are the universe. You're not just inside of reality. You're not like a thing that was born into reality. You are reality. And I don't just mean that from some mystical religious point of view. I mean from the scientific point of view. If all you do is just buy strict materialist, atheist, hard-nosed science, you still can't deny the fact that you are reality. You're not just in reality, you are reality. That's a lot of things that seems kind of obvious when I say it, but this is not obvious to most scientists and atheists. And now you might say, well, Leo, yeah, I am reality, but so what? Where does that get us? Well, it gets you a lot further than you would think. Because if you think that you're a human ape within reality, that puts you one step away from reality. There's a step of removal there from reality. And this is actually very important because it creates an epistemological obstacle that scientific-minded people and materialists don't know how to overcome. Whereas if you realize that you are reality, that changes everything. It seems subtle, but it changes everything. And then when you realize that you are reality, that means any property or quality that you have, reality has, right? It's not, here's the trick, is that it's not merely that humans are intelligent because they're intelligent creatures that evolved within reality. No. It's that reality is intelligent and reality is doing humanness. Reality is giving a part of its intelligence to create humanness out of itself. Think of it like Legos. I've made this analogy in the past where you can use Legos to build some sort of higher order structure. You can use these little bricks. So you're combining these bricks and then you build, let's say you build a pirate ship. I used to do that. I had a pirate ship when I was a kid. So you got this Lego pirate ship. If you're looking at if you're sort of like lost in the higher order structure of the pirate ship, you think it's a pirate ship and you forget the fact that it's made out of Legos. But the pirate ship itself is made out of the actual blocks. And whatever properties the blocks have, the pirate ship has. So like if we had Lego blocks that are made out of gold, the pirate ship would be made out of gold. And it would be so the pirate ship form is actually participating in something more fundamental, which is the blocks and the substance of the blocks, which in this case would be gold. Well, that seems fairly simple, except with the universe now it gets much more abstract and far out there. It's not just that the universe is made out of atoms and that everything possesses the quality of atoms. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the universe possesses consciousness. And it's by virtue of the fact that the universe possesses consciousness that you possess consciousness. And so really what's happening is that the things that science thinks are just these dumb properties, like gold or big or small or hot or cold or wood or metal, whatever property or substance you think is fundamental to reality, what's not being understood, because awakening hasn't happened, with awakening you would understand this, is that actually these are all attributes are figments of consciousness. So really gold is not a physical thing. Gold is a figment of consciousness. Consciousness imagines gold. It's because the universe is infinitely conscious that it can imagine fucking gold. And also why you're intelligent. The reason you're intelligent is because the universe gave you intelligence, a little bit of it. And the reason a rat is less intelligent than you is because the universe gave it a little bit less intelligence than you. And since you are the universe, you are reality, you are consciousness, because you are it, there's not that step of removing that veil of perception and that epistemic boundary that was created by materialism. That's been removed. So therefore, you can participate in more of the qualities of the universe, which would be everything taken to an nth degree. Perfection, goodness, beauty, unity, intelligence. So see, notice what happened here. When I first presented this argument to you, it sounded kind of weak and silly and dumb. And if you gave it to an atheist, he would instantly debunk it. But then when I presented to you the much more robust version of this argument, it made it much more powerful and convincing. You see? And the only reason I was able to do that is because I have a very direct understanding of the nature of consciousness and the universe. Not as speculation or belief, but because I have it, because I'm the universe. You might wonder, like, Leo, who are you to say these things to us and to act like you know all this stuff? You can't know these things. You're just a dumb ape living on a planet. You can't know these things. And my response to you is, you think I'm a dumb ape living on a planet. Actually, I'm the universe. So I can know these things because I'm realizing that I'm the universe. And you don't realize it yet. Some of you do. But if you're skeptical about all this stuff, then you don't realize it yet, right? So that's what awakening is for. You're missing that awakening. Again, you can't assume that you're not the universe. Don't assume that you aren't. Don't assume that you're just some dumb hairy ape inside the universe. Maybe you're more than that. Maybe you're participating in something much bigger. And that is what we would call God. Now, this still leaves the question of like, well, Leo, but then, why is God called loving and so forth? Well, actually, this argument kind of does make a pretty good case for the kind of qualities of God that the other arguments didn't really convincingly demonstrate at all, because this argument from participation sort of relies on this notion of qualities. So in this argument, if you assume that there's various degrees to nth degree of qualities, then what we would say is that what God is just the sum total of all the nth degrees of every possible quality, which includes intelligence, love, perfection, goodness, and so forth. Now, still, you're probably wondering, well, Leo, but then what is God? What does it even mean to say that you're taking all of these qualities and sort of lumping them together to nth degree, combining them together, and then like, what is that thing? You're talking about a thing. It has to be a thing or it's not real. It's just a concept, right? So what is that thing of all these properties combined together? What is that? Well, that's infinity. Of course, it doesn't help you for me to say that. Yeah, you're not going to get what that thing is without awakening. That's what awakening is. Awakening is when you realize what that thing is that you don't currently understand and that you won't understand no matter how much I talk about it. So we have to move on. The next argument is Aquinas' teleological proof. It goes like this. Step 1 is that natural bodies act towards ends and goals despite themselves not being intelligent. Step 2, all unintelligent things must be directed by an intelligence outside themselves. Step 3, for example, it's not a step really, it's just an example, is that, for example, an arrow reaches its target only if directed by an archer. That's an example he uses. And then the last step is that this intelligence is God. So what do we make of this argument? So the first step is that natural bodies act towards ends and goals despite themselves not being intelligent. Is this true? Natural bodies, so like, let's say the moon, it acts towards ends and goals despite not being intelligent. So the moon, we would want to say, under materialism, the moon is not intelligent. But in a certain sense, it does act towards, like, it stays in its orbit consistently. Does that require intelligence, though? That's very iffy. It's very question-begging. Does the moon's orbit require intelligence? If you're a strict materialist, you want to say, no, it's just moving along physical, forces. That's not intelligent. But then if you go one layer deeper, you could say, yeah, but the actual mechanism and fine-tuning of the physical forces, that's really where the intelligence is. The intelligence, you have to think about intelligence in a much broader and more abstract way than something like stuff that the brain is doing. That's not what's being meant by intelligence. Intelligence is the order with which everything in the universe is arranged and with which it moves, right? So under this paradigm, the moon, in a certain sense, we could say, is intelligent because it moves in this intelligent way. That doesn't mean the moon can solve math problems or do an IQ test. We're talking about a different notion of intelligence here, much broader than an IQ test. So don't strawman this. Really consider that intelligence could be something much wider and broader and more abstract than an IQ test can measure. So in this sense, let's just grant that the moon is doing something intelligent when it's orbiting the Earth. But Aquinas wants to say that the intelligence of the moon's movement is not coming from the moon. The moon doesn't have a brain, obviously. So the intelligence is coming from outside of it. The intelligence is coming from, we could say, from the universe's structure, from the physical laws. The physical laws are so intelligently designed and arranged that they are imparting their intelligence to the movement of the moon in the same way that, for example, if we design a car, we could say the car is intelligent. What we mean by a car being intelligent is not that it has a brain and it can solve an IQ test. What we mean is that all the parts in the car are arranged in such a way that when I turn the ignition key, all the right parts move, electrons move through the wires, spark plugs spark on time. Everything is so perfectly synchronized. The pistons, start moving. Gasoline and oil is sprayed into the combustion chambers, and all of this is moving. Crankshafts are spinning, wheels are rotating, traction is happening, gears are shifting in a transmission, and now the car is behaving and accomplishing an intelligent operation. Again, does this mean the car is now going to drive itself to where you want it to go? No, that's not what's meant. What's meant is that the operation of the mechanism is intelligent. The intelligence is not found in like a brain located somewhere. The intelligence is distributed through the organization of all the parts in harmony in the system. And then we say that intelligence in that car, it's not in the car, it came from outside the car, which means a human engineered it. It's really the intelligence of the engineer that created the car. And if the engineer was stupid, he could not create a well-functioning car. It would be a dumb car, not a smart car. So you see, the way that I'm framing it now this whole argument seems a lot more plausible. It's not as stupid as it sounds at first. Now, of course, it's kind of question-begging because you wonder, like, well, the intelligence of the human created the car. Okay, we can grant that. But then the real question is here, was intelligence needed to create the physical laws that are moving the orbits of the planets? It's obvious that a car needed intelligence, but it's not so obvious that the orbits of the planets needed intelligence. Couldn't have that arisen spontaneously through a naturalistic process? That's where I think this proof falls apart, is that that's not obvious, that it couldn't. You can't know that ahead of time without awakening. It could just be the case that the laws, through some sort of multiverse scenario, many different universes were tried, they failed, they collapsed, they imploded, and then one arose which was conducive to life. And this was happening through some sort of naturalistic, like brute force mechanical process where just every possibility of universe was tried until eventually our current one happened to work. And so here it is. And that wasn't intelligent. It was actually a dumb process of pure luck. Or maybe it's not even luck, but it's more just like brute force. Can we say that brute force is intelligence? Like if, for example, there is a multiverse and literally every single possible universe was tried, can't you see that it's necessary, logically necessary, that at least one of them would be our universe? So literally just through a brute force process, it should be possible to create our universe. It's just that you'll also have a bunch of really fucked up and bad universes out there. But as long as we're not in it to see it, then who cares, right? Maybe that's how it works. And so maybe the universe did come from actually a dumb, brute force, unintelligent force. We have to be open to that possibility. So how can Aquinas say that it didn't happen that way? How would he know? Not so obvious. The next proof, it's called the Neoplatonic proof. It goes like this. Step 1, the material world is made out of multiplicity. There's many different things, right? Step 2, all multiplicity requires absolute unity as its source. Step 3, the absolute unity must be beyond being, beyond intellect, beyond definition. Step 4, it must be absolutely simple with no internal distinctions or composition. And this unity is called God. That's the whole argument. How convinced are you that God exists? So let's break it down a little bit. Step 1, the material world is made of multiplicity. Okay, obvious, we can grant that, no problem. Step 2, all multiplicity requires absolute unity as its source. That's much more iffy. What does this even mean? All multiplicity requires absolute unity as its source. But like, why couldn't we have a multiverse where we have different universes, so we have multiplicity of universes? On the other hand, the counter argument to that is to say, well, yeah, you can have all these multiverses, but then doesn't that mean that you have some sort of containing higher order structure that contains all the multiverse? Like, something has to hold all the universes together, right? Even if you have many of them. Or maybe not. See, again, this is such a fundamental question that really, like, this is actually like an empirical question. We would want to be able to do science on this to figure out which way actually does it work. Because we don't know. We don't want to assume how it works. Is it possible to have two totally different universes that are in no way absolutely whatsoever in contact with each other and never will be? Just like these pocket realities that are just completely different and will never know each other, never contact each other. Is that possible? And how would we know? By definition, it's impossible to know that. And yet, it could be possible. So who are we to say? We can't exclude that possibility. So the next step of the proof is that absolute unity must be beyond being, beyond intellect, beyond definition. I mean, this is true, of course, but how do you explain to somebody who hasn't experienced infinity or awakening or unity, who doesn't know what these things are? It's not going to make sense. What does it mean to say that you have an absolute unity? Like, what is this unity? Is it an object? Can't really be an object, but then what is it? Plotinus says that it must be absolutely simple with no internal distinctions or compositions. Okay, so you have this absolute simple unity. Is it completely empty? Okay, but then we're calling it God. Okay, but then how do you get the sort of classical features of God from this absolutely simple unity. Again, it sounds like a void. How is this different from a void? How is this absolutely simple unity, not just nothing? And if God is just nothing, then why are we even talking about God? Why not just talk about nothing? That's not really explained. Okay, the next argument and proof is the moral argument. It goes like this. First, objective moral truths exist. Second, moral truths can only exist if God exists. Third, a purely scientific reality cannot have objective good and bad in it. Fourth, science cannot answer questions of value and meaning. You can't get an ought from an is. And lastly, moral conscience cannot just be a natural faculty. It requires consciousness of God's goodness. So this moral argument is commonly made by Christians and theists of that kind of persuasion. So let's look at this. So first step of the argument, objective moral truths exist. Is this true? That's not obvious that it's true. Why can't moral truths just be relative, subjective projections? Christians don't even seriously consider this possibility, but they should, because it's very obvious that morality could just be a human construction. And if it is, then there goes your God. No God for you. You see how dangerous it is to actually hinge your God on any of these kind of arguments? Because if one of these arguments fails, for example, if God requires there to be morality and then morality is realized to just be a human construction, well, no more God for you. So you have to be careful about what kind of arguments you subscribe to. Not very wise to hinge God to morality. The next step is moral truths can only exist if God exists. Is that true? Let's see. That's not obvious either. Why can't moral truths just be something that you can get through reason? Just through pure reason. For example, why is it morally wrong to torture somebody? Because it creates suffering, and suffering is harmful to biological organisms. If there was no suffering and biological organisms weren't harmed by suffering, then torture wouldn't be good, wouldn't be bad. It could be good. Why is theft wrong and bad? Theft is bad because you're taking the property or energy of some other creature that worked hard for something, and then you're stealing it. But you can look at it purely rationally. Like, the reason theft is wrong is because, again, when you steal from somebody, you're causing suffering to them and you're endangering their survival. So why couldn't you just boil all of morality down to survival? The reason we say things are bad is because it hinders survival. And we don't need God to explain that. Survival is just like what humans or animals need to live. And so if you want to be good, you don't need God. All you need is just to respect the survival of other organisms. Why can't we just boil down all morality to that? Seems quite plausible. In fact, that is a very accurate description of how humans do morality. It's not like humans are these hyper-moral, platonic creatures that live in this world of perfect moral clarity and goodness. It's the opposite. Humans live like animals, and even the so-called moral ones behave like savages and will exploit each other. And the only reason they don't is because when they look at the suffering they cause, that causes them suffering. There's a sort of a mirror neuron response. Torturing someone is not as easy as it seems. Go try torturing somebody. It'll be hard. Most people will cringe, and they will not enjoy the process of torturing somebody. So that's what keeps torture away. It's not God or your knowledge of God, or that God gave you some commandments or some divine intuition about torture. It's just that you find torture disgusting if you do it. So the next part of this argument is that a purely scientific reality cannot have objective good and bad. We can grant that in a sort of a absolute sense that science, according to science, science doesn't call things good or bad. All that science can do is just tell us that, like, you shouldn't do that because it will harm or kill somebody. And then whether you want to kill them or not, that is up to you. Science doesn't make any value judgments about whether killing is good or bad. Killing a virus or a bacteria could be good for saving a human life. But science can't tell you which bacteria you should or shouldn't kill. That's that's a more iffy question. So yeah, it could be the case that science doesn't give us an absolute sense of good and bad, but that could just be because there isn't one and because we don't need one. And the universe just doesn't have those things because good and bad are just much higher order things that are really just tools that we use to survive amongst each other as a collective, right? The reason we need notions of good and bad is because we don't just live individually. If you were the only person on the planet, there would really be no such thing as good and bad. You could live however you want, and it would be mostly fine. But since you live with other humans, you need some sort of rules so that we're not living in a hellscape. So that works. That sort of undercuts this whole moral argument. So the next step of this moral argument, it says that science cannot answer questions of value and meaning. You can't get an ought from an is. That's true, but it also might not be a problem. And the final step of this argument says that moral conscience cannot just be natural faculty. It requires consciousness of God's goodness. This is not obvious at all. Moral conscience could be a natural faculty. After all, for example, animals live together mostly peacefully. You can see a group of monkeys, a flock of birds, a school of fish. Are you going to say that a school of fish has God's goodness, consciousness of God's goodness? No, it's just a school of fish. It's behaving like a school of fish very robotically, and it just behaves. And these fish are hard-coded and programmed to get along with each other because they need to, because if they didn't, they would all die. So it's a school of fish. They don't need morality for that. They don't need some sort of Platonic moral conscience. And then if a school of fish can behave that way, and for example, a pride of lions can live together mostly peacefully. Now, lions sometimes eat their young and abuse each other and maybe even kill each other. But you know what? Humans do that too. Ultimately, what is the difference between a pride of lions and a group of humans? And who's to say which of them is more moral? I could make the case that humans have less morality than a group of lions. And lions, you don't want to say that lions have some sort of higher consciousness of God's goodness. That's not why lions get along. Lions get along just based on their natural instincts and because ultimately they need to get along in order to survive because they couldn't survive individually. Now here's the next argument. The next argument goes like this. Atheists are kidding themselves when they think that their morality is coming from a secular source, like I was just describing. So the Christian theist wants to say that a true atheist would actually be an immoral psychopath. And that really what atheists are doing is that they're actually piggybacking off the moral foundation created by religion and by God. This is an argument that Jordan Peterson likes to make. It's a bad no true Scotsman argument because what Jordan Peterson wants to say is that there's no such thing as a true atheist. Even when an atheist, there's no such thing as a true moral atheist. If you were a true atheist, you would be immoral because you would believe in nothing, and nothing would ground your sense of right and wrong because you need God for that. And even if you don't consciously believe in God, still in some way you're actually leveraging God because either you grew up in a Judeo-Christian culture, And so even if you don't believe it, you have those habits, it's baked into your culture and you got it from your culture. And then he might say that cultures that don't have that kind of moral foundation, they turn to evil precisely because they lack it. And then he would say that ultimately, where did that moral foundation come from? It wasn't just invented by humans arbitrarily. It came from God. And that's what the whole Bible is about teaching morality through lessons that were gotten from God and then disseminated through a culture. And then a culture was built around this. And now, even if you're secular, and even if you're atheist, and even if you want to be a nihilist, you're still living off that moral foundation. And to the extent that foundation is eroded is to the extent that our society is going to hell. That's what Jordan Peterson would argue. So how convincing is this argument? Well, of course, it doesn't prove that God exists. Yeah, it's the no true Scotsman fallacy is the problem. Jordan Peterson really needs to open his mind to the possibility that you could have an atheist who is perfectly moral and is not a psychopath and is a real atheist. And in fact, he could be more moral than your religious Christian. And in fact, that's usually the case. It is the case that many genuine atheists, and I was one, so I'm speaking from direct experience here, I'm not just guessing, many genuine atheists who have no belief in God whatsoever and do not subscribe to the Judeo-Christian ethic and culture, that they can be perfectly good people simply because they have consciousness and intelligence. And if you're intelligent, then you understand that behaving in a highly selfish way is counterproductive. You don't need Christianity to tell you that. and you don't need God to tell you that, right? A lot of this stuff is just very, very obvious. Stop being a selfish prick. That's the sum total of morality for you. It's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be super complicated. You can derive it yourself. Now, of course, there's it's so tricky here because there's a more subtle advanced layer at which actually Jordan Peterson is making a better point than he seems. So even though he is committing the no true Scotsman fallacy, there's a deeper layer where, notice what I just said. I said, through intelligence, you can just figure out to stop being a selfish prick because it's counterproductive. But notice that assumes intelligence. Now, if you're an atheist and a materialist, you think that intelligence is just something natural, biological, the brain is doing. But as we talked about before, if you awaken, you'll realize that intelligence is coming from God. It's not just that intelligence is coming from God, intelligence is God. So when you realize that intelligence is God, actually it is true that atheists are only moral to the extent that they are intelligent. And literally, to have an intelligent atheist is to have an atheist who is participating in the intelligence of God, but of course the atheist has no idea that that's what's happening. So in a certain very perverse and sick sense, I don't mean sixth sense, I said sick, diseased sense, Jordan Peterson is right that atheists are piggybacking off of God. But the way that he describes it is incorrect. The way that I'm describing it is the correct explanation. So I hope that you're seeing how many layers there are to these arguments and how you can be wrong at surface layers and then right at deeper layers. And also vice versa. You could be right at the surface and then wrong at the deeper layers, depending on how deep you go, how deep you understand the stuff, how you frame things. See, how you frame it is so fucking important. Because you could frame any of these arguments in a stupid way and then it'll be false. Or you could frame it in a very intelligent way and then it'll come out to be true. The next argument is argument from reason and intelligibility. And this is sort of now going to be connecting with what I just said about intelligence. The argument goes like this. Step 1, the world is intelligible to human reason. Step 2, this suggests a rational foundation to reality itself. Step 3, God is this rationality or intelligibility itself, taken to the nth degree. That's the whole argument. So you see, the problem with naturalism, materialism, and atheism and rationalism is that it assumes that rationality and intelligibility is a natural phenomenon. And that's a very sneaky assumption because it seems so obviously true, right? The brain generates intelligence, the brain generates rationality, and the brain is just physical matter, and that's all there is to it, and there's no God in this equation. That's how it seems. However, this is an illusion. When you awaken, you realize that rationality is not just something that some chimp brain is doing. Rationality is deeply interwoven with the very structure and metaphysics of consciousness. Because reality is not just a dumb clockwork machine like you thought, like you assumed under materialism. It's consciousness. Reality is a mind. If you switch your paradigm from that of a clockwork to that of an infinite mind, when you have an infinite mind, this infinite mind has the capacity for intelligibility, sentience, consciousness, and rationality. It has an internal logic to it. You could call that the logos, although that word is very badly abused by people like Jordan Peterson. So I don't even want to use that word. But it does have a sort of a logical structure to it. But this is not at all obvious to a materialist because your paradigm is backwards. So it actually is true that God is the rationality and intelligibility of the universe taken to the nth degree. Because if you take intelligibility to the nth degree, what you get is you get infinite consciousness, infinite mind. That's what God is. But how convincing will this argument be to an atheist? Probably not convincing, because they have their paradigm locked. They're paradigm locked into thinking that the universe is a dumb clockwork. How can you help a person like that? Okay, the next argument is called the performative contradiction of naturalism. It goes like this. Step 1, if naturalism is true, then human perception and reason is just the product of survival. Step 2, if naturalism is true, then naturalistic philosophy and scientific reasoning is unreliable. Step 3, even the doing of science and math proves a faith in your faculties, which is really faith in God. That's the whole argument. So look at how this works. If naturalism is true, then human perception is only there as a product of survival. In fact, people like Donald Hoffman make this point. He's a sort of cognitive scientist, philosopher, who's been talking about this model that everything you see is just a product of survival, so you don't even get the true view of the world because it's all just mediated by natural selection. And natural selection doesn't select for truth, it selects for survival. In a certain sense, that's true. In a certain sense, that's false. So, look, if naturalism is true, the problem here is that there's a performative contradiction in that if the naturalist view is true, the naturalistic philosophy and scientific reasoning itself has no basis for being reliable. You see, if you're going to say that natural selection and evolution has produced your nervous system and that your nervous system is detached from truth, from any sort of deep metaphysical truth or God, then you're going to say that it's all just whatever is working for your organism to survive. But then now you're using this nervous system to then generate your own model of evolution. That means your model of evolution is not true. It's just something you're using for survival. So it's self-defeating, you see. So science, by this notion, is self-defeating. For you to actually genuinely think that science is giving you a true picture of reality, you need to ground that in something deeper than evolution. It has to ground in a faith in your faculties. What does science require? Science and math requires that you believe in logic, reason, scientific method, deduction, induction, perception, and other things. For example, you need to, as a scientist, you need to believe that you're not hallucinating right now. that all of your science is not a hallucination. You need to believe that you're not in a simulation created by aliens, that you're not a brain in a vat. You need to believe that you're not being influenced by some malevolent evil demon in the background who is manipulating your science and so forth. You need to believe all these things in order to do science. And scientists are in denial about this. So the argument goes. And that really, scientists do have a sort of crypto faith in God. It's just that they don't call it God. What they call it is just reason or scientific method or logic or even something like evolution. As a scientist, you're trusting that evolution gave you a brain that gets you to truth. Now, if you say, well, no, Leo, I don't need to trust that. As a scientist, I don't need to believe in truth. There is no truth. As a scientist, I can be a pure pragmatist and I can just say science is just whatever works. But this is incoherent. You're not going to be able to maintain that worldview, because in the end, as a scientist, you're going to be making truth claims. For example, you're going to want to say that God doesn't exist. You're going to want to say that unicorns don't exist. These are truth claims. And you're not just saying that unicorns don't exist just because it's impractical. You're not just a pragmatist. If you think you're a pragmatist, you're lying to yourself. And this is part of what this argument is putting forth, is that you're confused and you're deceiving yourself when you think that you're not participating in the faculties of God, of consciousness. You are. Science ultimately requires consciousness. God is consciousness. So the argument here is that you couldn't do science without consciousness being reliable. And the only reason your consciousness is reliable is because God maintains it. Now, will this convince anybody? Probably not. But this literally is the case. In fact, I'll take it one even more radical extreme. The only reason you have sanity, this is beyond rationality and beyond intelligence. This is sanity. This is something so profound that nobody understands what sanity is. The only reason you're able to maintain sanity is because God is maintaining your sanity. What I'm saying is that if God was not maintaining your sanity right now, demons would be infesting your mind. Demons and horrors, the likes of which you could not imagine. Now you wonder, Leo, this sounds crazy. How could there be demons and so forth? Well, what is this nonsense? This is very unscientific. Yes, it's very unscientific from your narrow vantage point. But when you realize that the universe is just consciousness, a demon is just consciousness. No different than a unicorn or a fucking horse. There's no difference between a unicorn, a horse, and a demon. They're all just forms of consciousness. Right? What God is doing with your consciousness right now is so fucking intelligent that it's maintaining your sanity. This is so intelligent, you don't even understand this is happening. You've been taking your sanity for granted your entire life. So, on a surface level, it's kind of silly to say that science requires God. On a much deeper, more subtle, advanced level, you realize that you couldn't even be sane without God. But that's way beyond what people understand. The next argument goes like this. It's the argument from information theory. Step one of the argument says that DNA contains coded information that functions as language and programming code. Step two, according to information theory, codes and language always originate from conscious minds, not random processes. Step three, no natural undirected process has ever been observed to create code or language. Step four, genetic code could only have originated from conscious intelligence. That's the whole argument. This is an argument made by Perry Marshall. He wrote a book about this. It's a very interesting argument, but it's a little bit tricky. Let's go through some of these steps. So first, DNA contains coded information that functions as language and programming code. This, I think, is pretty solid point. He argues it in the book. He analyzes what language and information are, and there's actually a science of information founded by Claude Shannon. So there's information theory. It's complicated. I don't know it too well. But from what I understand, DNA is sort of a language or a programming code. So we grant that. Step 2 is, according to information theory, codes and language always originate from conscious mind. This is question begging. The problem here is that this is question begging because we don't really know. We only have one single source of information, which is human beings. Human beings create information, code, language. The problem, though, is that human beings under the scientific model came from natural selection. So if you assume materialism, the scientific picture, then you can say that through natural selection and DNA and so forth, we got humans, and then humans now create language and computer code and so forth. But then the question is, where did the code come from in the DNA to create the humans? So Perry Marshall wants to say, well, just like human code has to come from minds, because a human code cannot be generated through random processes, because anytime you introduce randomness into an information system, into a code, it actually degrades the code. You don't get an improvement in code by introducing random errors and mutations. For example, if you take programming code, take the source code for Microsoft Windows, and start just randomly changing lines of code here and there, hoping that randomly changing this line of code, that line of code, will produce a better version of Microsoft Windows. Perry Marshall wants to say here that this is impossible. You can't create Microsoft Windows through a process of randomly splicing codes together and just seeing what will work. It can't work that way. The Microsoft operating system is so intelligent that it had to be created by an intelligent mind, not through this random mutation process. Because random mutations introduce noise, and noise always destroys information. This is something that information theory says. So that all seems to be pretty solid. The problem, though, is that it's not so obvious because we don't really have a lot of different examples of it. We only have a single example of life originating. So it's not so obvious that life itself required an intelligence to create it. Now, Perry Marshall says that no natural undirected process has ever been observed to create language or code. The problem with that statement is that it's question begging because it really, the real question here is, did life originate through an undirected process? The one example we have of that is life itself, right? So Perry Marshall wants to say there are no examples of it, but maybe life is that one example. And then it would be the source, not only of all of life, but then also the humans who then generate all the computer code. So this question of, is it possible just from scratch, without any intelligence, to sort of generate bottom up a chain of ever more complex things that ultimately end up in genuine information and language and programming code? Is that possible? Perry Marshall wants to say no, because that requires God. Now, a materialist atheist would say, yes, it is possible, because that's literally what evolution is. That's literally what life is. And that, yes, humans are needed to be intelligent to create Microsoft Windows, but that does not mean that that kind of intelligence was also required to create the very, very first living organisms, which could have somehow come together spontaneously through, just through the structure of chemistry, basically, organic chemistry. Even though we don't exactly know how that would happen. But it's conceivable. And what do I think about this? Well, I'm inclined to say that it is possible. I'm open to the possibility that life originated just through the intelligence in the structure of organic chemistry, which is ultimately grounded in the intelligence of physics. So the problem is that Perry Marshall's argument here isn't really conclusive, because it begs the question on this issue of how life came about, and we don't really know. That's an empirical question. We need to do more science on that. But my guess is the way that life came about is that obviously it didn't come about through randomness. It did come about, so in a deeper sense, Perry Marshall is correct. He's correct in that God did create the whole universe. But that does not mean that God literally like stuck his finger into the primordial ooze to create the first organism through somehow, tinkering with the genetic code. I don't think it works that way. I think the way it works is that just the genius of God is in the structure, the top-down structure and intelligence that is baked through and suffused through the entire fabric of physics and logic and space-time, which ultimately leads to a spontaneous generation of life. It seems kind of spontaneous and dumb, but it's not really dumb. There's a much deeper intelligence behind it. But it's not that God is literally interfering in your DNA. Okay, the next argument is the argument from free will. So this is a pretty weak argument, but it just says that the existence of free will suggests a source beyond material determinism. If material determinism was true, then free will wouldn't exist, and free will must exist, right? So, therefore, God. This is a bad argument for several reasons, because there's a lot of bad assumptions here. First of all, it assumes that free will exists. This is not obvious. It's not obvious what free will is. In fact, I have a whole deep conversation called Does Free Will Exist? Go check that out. The issue of free will is very difficult, and you need to be open to the possibility that there is no free will. So you don't want to assume it. You don't want to hinge your belief in God on whether free will exists. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that, it's possible that there is free will and that the universe is not deterministic, but there's no God. That's also a possibility. So the connection between free will and God is very sketchy. In fact, and it's actually so here is where theists really go wrong, because here's the real mindfuck for you. What you'll realize when you have your awakening and you realize what God really is, you'll realize that God is absolute. Absolute means it has no contingency. It exists as a tautology. That means everything exists as a tautology. That means there's no wiggle room in the existence of anything in the universe. That means that the universe is completely determined. That means there's no free will. So it's actually the opposite of what theists think. It's because there is no free will that God exists. That's the mindfuck here. So it's way worse than theists think. You don't need free will for the existence of God, because God is just a logical, metaphysical, ontological tautology. It has to exist. There's only one way God can exist, which is as it exists. That's such a profound issue that I can't really go into it here. We don't have time. The next argument is from consciousness, which says that the existence of consciousness suggests a non-material source. After all, how can dumb matter, ever become conscious? This is the hard problem of consciousness. So this argument says basically that the hard problem of consciousness will never be resolved by science, because consciousness is a non-material thing. How convincing is this argument? Well, it's not very convincing to a scientist. However, this argument is literally true because the universe is consciousness, God is consciousness, and so literally the existence of consciousness is your proof of God. However, this is not obvious because you're not conscious enough to recognize what consciousness is, and that consciousness is infinite and absolute. That would require awakening. So again, the irony here is that atheists, scientists, materialists, rationalists, skeptics, people like Sam Harris, those types of people, when they argue that God doesn't exist, Richard Dawkins, they're using consciousness to argue that God doesn't exist. And consciousness is God. So they're literally God arguing that God doesn't exist. It's the most absurd and stupid situation, but that's what they're doing. But the reason that it passes as something legitimate and scientific and rational is because everybody that they're talking to is equally as unconscious as they are. So it works because it's the blind leading the blind. But anybody who's conscious, who's awoken, will realize that it's a joke. It's a joke. The next argument is from Scripture. It goes like this. Scripture is based on historical events, and Scripture is the Word of God or divinely inspired, if not the Word of God. Scripture contains powerful psychological truths, and Scripture says that God exists, so therefore God exists. And things like the Quran are just too perfectly written and too beautiful and contain too many powerful truths to be the work of some illiterate peasant. It had to be inspired by God. That's the only way the Quran could have been written. And various kinds of arguments like this. So this is the argument from Scripture. So does that convince you? No, this is a very poor argument for several reasons. First of all Scripture was written by humans, not by God, although there's a deeper layer. I'll say in a second. So all Scripture was written by humans, so that's a problem. Second problem is that humans are very corrupt creatures. And even if humans are divinely inspired, divine inspiration does not preclude corruption and evil and self-deception and falsehood and illusion. So it could be the case that Muhammad was divinely inspired to write the Quran, but it could be the case that his ego got in the way, he was corrupt, and there are falsehoods in the Quran. So you can't trust any human source because it could be corrupt, it could be infested with ego, and it could be false, and it could be self-deceived. And not only could it be, all of it is. And on top of that, you're not getting the original scriptures from the original people, you're getting stories and mythologies and compilations and recompilations and interpretations and reinterpretations and reanalysis, and also these scriptures are kind of figurative, so there's a question of how you're interpreting them. You could be misinterpreting them too. Even if the scripture was perfect and written by God, in the hands of an ego like you, it'll get misinterpreted. So even if God exists, you read your scripture, but then your ideas of what God is and what God wants you to do or not do, that's all your corruption and interpretation and projection. So even though I'm saying God is real, that does not mean that I'm saying that your ideas about God are real. In fact, all your ideas about God are wrong. I promise you they're all wrong. They must be wrong. You're not going to understand God through scripture or belief or anything you heard in church. None of that will allow you to understand God. In fact, it'll hold you back. So scripture is one of the worst arguments. You don't even know if the stories are true. You don't even know, technically speaking, you don't even know that Muhammad wrote the Quran. You don't know that. You don't even know that Jesus existed, technically speaking. These are assumptions. These are all assumptions. And if you're doing good, rigorous philosophy and epistemology, you're not going to assume any of those things. So you can't know that God exists from scriptures. Nor can you know what God is from scriptures. Or even if you do, you'll have very bad ideas. The next argument is the argument from popularity, which goes like this. The majority of the world's population believes in God. This couldn't be the case unless God was real. It would be impossible to delude so many people for so long. Sure, it's possible to delude like a little group of people here. You can have a little cult here. You can maybe delude an entire empire, but you can't have everybody across every continent believing in God across thousands of years. That would be impossible. That level of self-deception is impossible. So this argument goes. How good is this argument? How convincing? Well, it's a very poor argument for the following reason. Because, in fact, self-deception is the most salient feature of human existence. Self-deception is the default and the norm. the majority of mankind is self-deceived about all manner of things, including the very nature of God. So even though I'm saying God exists, God does not exist in the way that the majority of mankind believes it exists. In fact, what most of mankind believes about God is so wrong that it's better for them not to believe in God than to believe in the wrong things that they believe about God. Is it possible to delude so many people for so long? Yeah, it is. That's what religion is. Now, there's an even deeper layer, however, to this argument, which actually is true. It actually is the case that the reason that people all around the world, since the beginning of time, in every empire, in every civilization, have believed in God in various forms. And that is because God exists. That's true. These people are not deceived that God exists, but they are deceived about what God is, how God works, what this means, proofs for God, the epistemology and metaphysics underneath God, all that. That's where they're deceived. And also all the corruption that comes with religion and spiritual schools. That's all corruption. But the underlying kernel that there is a God, that is true. So actually, the reason God is so popular is, ironically, because it's true. It's just that people are deluded about what it is. The next argument is the argument from success, which goes like this. Religion works because it points to valid truths. If religion was all just fiction and fairy tales, then it wouldn't work. Religion could only be successful as it's been, because morality is real and God is real. How convincing is this argument? In a certain sense, it's not convincing, because religion working, yes, religion works, because religion is designed to serve human survival. And serving human survival has very little to do with God. It's actually antithetical to understanding God. So religion is actually a corruption of God precisely because it works so well. For religion to actually be true, it would have to not work. Because understanding God is not a practical thing. It's a highly metaphysical, it's the most metaphysical, the most philosophical pursuits. So religion works not because God is real. Religion works because it has certain psychological patterns that are true for human beings and so forth. So that's on one level. On a deeper level, though, religion does work because God exists. And the reason that is because religion was written and invented by people, sages, who had direct awakenings and insights into the nature of God, such as myself, and then they distilled that information, and out of those created powerful psychological teachings which were useful to people. So, for example, if you watch the Actualized.org body of work and you find it useful and you're able to use it to get a little bit of sex, to get a better job, to get a better career, and so forth, you can use it for all that, but you may not recognize that the reason I was able to give you that good advice and this good psychological insight into the nature of human beings and politics and sex and relationships and all this stuff and morality, the reason I was able to give you those insights is because I had direct experience of God, and literally it came from God through me to you. Whether you understand that or not is another question. You may not understand that for a long time until you experience that for yourself. You have some awakening. Then you'll understand where I got all this incredible insight from. But see, you can see that there's something truthful and very powerful about the Actualized.org teachings. Why is that? Is that because I'm so fucking big-brained and smart? No, it's because I figured out how to connect to something higher than myself. And so that is, in a sense, the origin of religion. If you took all of my teachings and you turned it into dogma, you'd have a religion. Of course, I make sure not to do that, because that's that's antithetical to the realization of God. So that's a trap. The next argument comes from perennial philosophy. It goes like this: all religions, all cultures, all eras have some notion of God. Of course, they all differ, but ultimately, you can see the commonality if you study them all. Study Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Sikhism, and Mormonism. All of them, in a sense, will be talking about God and pointing to the ultimate truth of awakening, just in very different ways. And people are very confused about the differences. They fight about the differences, but underneath all that corruption and noise, you find the signal, and that signal is God. So how convincing is this argument? This is actually a pretty good argument. Of course, it doesn't guarantee God or anything like that, but what I mean by it's a pretty good argument is that actually what helped me in my journey a lot is when I started to study various spiritual traditions, and I started to look for the commonality between them, and I realized how much commonality there is between all the different spiritual traditions, and that they're not as different as atheists would like to believe. For the atheist argument, it's very convenient to think that, well, but Leo, Buddhists don't believe in God, so you have all this contradiction, and so therefore God can't be real, because the Buddhists don't talk about God, they talk about nirvana and nothingness, and then the Christians talk about Christ, and then the Buddhists or the Hindus, they talk about, Ganesha. How is Ganesha the same thing as Christ and nothingness? Well, of course, these are all the same thing, but it takes a lot of intelligence to see the unity of all that. But yeah, you start to study, you see all the connections. If you want a good example of that, go check out my old episode called Aztec Non-Duality, where I read to you like some powerful non-dual spiritual stuff from the Aztec culture, ancient Aztec culture. And it's amazing how similar it is, for example, to Zen Buddhism. And so when you study a lot of this perennial philosophy, Ken Wilber has done a lot of work on this front, assembling a lot of different spiritual cultures and traditions, and then trying to unify them all, you see, it's quite convincing. Now, of course, it's not a guarantee, because these are just words in the end, human words, which you can't trust. But it's convincing that all these cultures are all pointing towards something. And you got to wonder, could it be that all these people across all these cultures, in all these different geographical time zones and areas and climates, that all of them were just deluded? The more you study it, the less plausible that argument becomes. And I think that atheists would benefit a lot from studying more of this perennial philosophy, as it's called. Of course, it's not going to be conclusive, but it's a good little, breadcrumb trail for you to follow to then start taking the pursuit of awakening seriously. The next argument is the argument from faith, which says that it doesn't matter if there's proof or evidence of God. The whole point is that you must have faith in God, blind faith. God doesn't reveal himself to us because God wants to test your blind faith. So just take the leap of faith. How good is this argument? This is an atrocious argument. This is probably the worst argument on this list. Do not have faith in God. This is very, very bad. If God is real, then be skeptical. Through your if God is real, you don't need to worry about being skeptical, because your skepticism will ultimately lead you to what's true. So really, all you have to care about is pursuing what's true. Don't pursue God. Don't have faith. Don't have belief. None of that stuff is needed. Just pursue what's true. And if God is true, you'll realize that. And if God is not true, you'll realize that. And either way, you'll have truth. And that's what really matters. What matters is not God. What matters is truth. So faith is very counterproductive to this process, because to realize God requires a deep, serious inquiry process. Faith prevents any kind of inquiry. The next argument is called Pascal's wager, which goes like this. You might as well believe in God just in case, because if you're wrong, you're going to go to hell. So believing in God has very little downside, but much upside. So you might as well just believe in God. How good is this argument? This is a terrible argument. First of all, because belief in God doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't actually get you to God. Second of all, the problem is that there's too much other stuff like this that you could believe, but you don't believe. For example, you don't apply this argument to the belief in unicorns, or flying tooth fairies, or Santa Claus, or spaghetti monsters, or anything like this. You only apply it in this sort of Christian sense. So it's really a rationalization. Just because someone is threatening you with hell doesn't mean that you believe in something, right? Like I could invent a religion which says that believe in my intergalactic space kangaroo, and if you don't, he's going to torture you. So according to Pascal's wager, you should believe in my intergalactic space kangaroo. Hey, just because it's just because it might be true and you don't want to get tortured. You see, you can invent an infinite number of ridiculous things to believe in just because someone threatens you with torture. This is not right. And also, when Pascal says that, believing in God has very little downside and much upside, this actually isn't true. There is a serious cost for believing in God blindly, believing in the Christian God. There's a cost to this. Don't think that you're getting away scot-free here, believing in this stuff. You're expending energy, reading the Bible, taking it seriously, going to church, praying to God, all this sorts of stuff. You're investing thousands and thousands of hours. And more than just that, you're investing your ego into it. It's creating a whole filter through which you see reality, and it's a very distorted, corrupt filter. And then you adopt all the corruptions. Because see, you're not just going to believe in God, you're also going to then, if you believe in God, then you also have to believe that you have to go to church, and you have to pray, and you have to accept Christian dogma. It's not enough just to believe in God. And then once you start doing all that, it becomes a whole religion, and then religion definitely has a huge downside. In fact, I would say it's mostly downside, little upside. The next argument is the argument from mystery, or sometimes called the God of the gaps. And it goes like this. Science cannot explain X, therefore God. For example, science cannot explain the origin of life, therefore God. Science cannot explain the Big Bang, therefore God. Science cannot explain consciousness, therefore God. Science cannot explain rainbows, therefore God. You see, now the rainbows science can explain, but 5,000 years ago, science could not explain rainbows. And so when you saw a rainbow, someone could have pointed that and said, oh, look, it's God. So how good is this argument? It's a bad argument. Because the truth is that most religious people are just backwards rationalizing, and they're looking for any excuse to find some kind of evidence for God. And the more science encroaches, and the more of reality science is able to explain, the less and less appeals believers and people who have faith can point to buttress their faith. See, the problem with faith is that it's not truth. You think you can fake your way to truth. You can't. Truth, when you have absolute truth, it gives you a kind of confidence that faith could never give you. Because in the back of your mind, no matter how much you bullshit yourself with your Christian faith, in the back of your mind, it isn't true. You don't know that it's true. It's just a belief. There's a difference between absolute consciousness and belief and faith. In the end, your faith is flimsy and it will crack. As soon as something bad happens to you in your life, you suffer a lot, you lose a loved one, a child or something, I promise you your faith will be shaken and destroyed, while absolute truth will withstand even death. So that's why you're a fool to want faith and belief over truth. So it's a mistake to hinge your knowledge of God on areas that science has not yet figured out, because tomorrow science might figure it out. And then what does that mean? That God isn't real? That's stupid. Your knowledge of God needs to be based in something absolute. Not belief, not faith, and not flimsy logical arguments that are backwards rationalizations, especially ones that are contending with the advancing edge of science. Because science is finding out new stuff all the time. What if science is able to make a conscious AI 10 years from now? Does that mean God doesn't exist now because science could do that? What if science creates artificial life 50 years from now? What does that mean? That there's no God because science now has figured out the mechanical origins of life? No. God is way more fundamental than all of that. There's nothing science will ever be able to do that will change the situation with God. Never, ever. Because science is consciousness, and consciousness is God. Okay, and the last few arguments. The argument from religious and mystical experience, which goes like this. People's personal experiences of the divine suggest God's existence. You have things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, supernatural experiences, paranormal experiences, astral projection, Christ consciousness, enlightenment, awakening, psychedelic experiences. These prove God. How convincing is this argument? Well, actually, I've saved this one for last because this is one of the best of this whole list. Because in the end, God is not a logical conclusion you come to. God is an experience. The way you know God exists is by experiencing it. And the experience is so absolute that it's beyond doubt. Now, this is not going to convince any atheist or scientific materialist like Sam Harris or whatever, or Richard Dawkins, because they're always going to say that, well, God is just a hallucination, could just be a hallucination. Your personal religious experiences mean nothing. That's because they have no idea what experience really is. They don't understand the metaphysics, the epistemology of experience itself. An experience of God is not just an experience. An experience of God transcends the notion of a brain and a perceptual system that or a human chimp animal biological creature that is having experience. You're transcending all that. But that's beyond the scope of explanation here. So yeah, mystical experience is A+, top notch. That's the best proof. However, there is a problem here, which is that you can have many corrupted experiences of God. There are many people who have what they call experiences of God, but they are corrupted, they are tangential, they're not direct, they're not clear, they're corrupted by the ego, they're misinterpreted, meanings are projected and attached to it, it's turned into some human nonsense, turned into a religion, turned into some new age woo-woo shit. Extremely common. So then the atheist will rightly say, well, Leo, if you're going to say that there's true experiences of God and false experiences of God, how do you distinguish between them? This seems like a major problem. And the answer is that yes, there is a major problem. Self-deception is a major problem for everybody. It's a problem for you, the atheist, and it's a problem for us, the non-atheists. There's no way around this problem. And in fact, it's such a deep problem that once you realize God, you're still going to be self-deceived. That's how big of a problem it is. So there's no solution to this problem, at least not that I'm going to give you here. Really, if you want a solution to the self-deception problem, that solution is called Actualized.org. But even that still contains self-deception in it. So it's a deep, deep, deep problem. Yeah. A lot of religious experiences are very poor understandings of God, not pure. And then the final argument is the argument from miracles, which says that there are reports of miraculous events out there, saints and so forth having miracles. That's proof of God. How good of an argument is that? It's a very bad argument because the truth is that you have never seen a miracle yourself, so all you have are stories, hearsay, and beliefs. and that's it. And none of those are reliable. The only miracle that would turn this into a good argument is awakening. So yeah, there is, on a deeper level, there actually is a miracle that will prove God to you, and that miracle is called awakening. All right, those are all the arguments. Let me know down below what were your favorites, which ones convinced you the most, which one's the worst. I'd like to know also what you think about my analysis of all this. Post your critiques. If you think there's holes in my analysis, post away. I welcome all that. Be as skeptical as you like. A few concluding remarks here as we wrap this up. So those were all the arguments. I encourage you to go through it again and really engage with the arguments, think about them. Don't take them for granted. Don't straw man them. Try to steel man them in your mind and see really what they're pointing to. But also look for flaws in the logic and so forth. Very importantly, as you do this, make a clear distinction between direct and indirect claims of God. What do I mean by direct? Direct means you have a direct encounter with God. So ask yourself right now, have you ever had a direct encounter with God? It's a yes or no question. If no, that's perfectly fine. That's just where you're at. That's the truth. And if you did, okay, great, then I don't need to explain much more to you. But if you didn't, then here's the problem. Now you're dealing with indirect stuff. Here's all the indirect stuff. A logical deduction is indirect. Intuition is indirect. Belief is indirect. A hunch is indirect. Faith is also indirect. Hearsay is indirect. Speculation is indirect. Probability, justification, thoughts and theories and models. All of that is indirect. Scientific method is also indirect. There's only one direct method, which is a direct encounter with God. Everything else is indirect. So, if you're dealing with indirect, you have to be very, very careful because it's not the real thing. And so you're going to get self-deceived one way or another. Whether you're for or against God is irrelevant. You're dealing with indirect epistemology. That's the problem. Remember that just because you suspect something is true and it feels true to you, whether it feels true to you that God should exist or it feels true to you that God is illogical and ridiculous, none of that matters because your feelings and intuitions are in the end self-deceptions. You must take self-deception extremely seriously in this work. If you don't, you'll never reach awakening. That's why I stress it so much. All of my work, there's only like one theme in my entire body of work, which is just self-deception. That's all I study is self-deception. Everything I teach is self-deception. If anybody ever makes arguments of God to you, ask them, rather than debating with them, be more intelligent. Ask them to identify their own assumptions. No matter what the argument they propose, ask them to identify their epistemic and metaphysical assumptions. And you will see that the majority of human beings will not be able to do this. And you will see them struggle. You will see their whole argument start to collapse. They will get flustered and paranoid and defensive and egotistical with you, no matter if they're atheists or theists. Because in the end, they have not done the work to identify all these assumptions. They have not carefully thought through the epistemology and the metaphysics. Someone like a Jordan Peterson hasn't. Someone like a Sam Harris hasn't. Someone like a Richard Dawkins hasn't. They haven't done these things. Someone like a Neil deGrasse Tyson hasn't done this. It hasn't been done by atheists or by theists. And you can very quickly figure out that they haven't done it by being very careful in the questions you ask them. You ask them epistemological questions. Don't ask them questions about their beliefs, whether there is a God or there isn't a God or morality or any of that stuff. Go straight to the epistemology, and you will see that that they are epistemological ignoramuses. 99% of people who make arguments for God have no idea what God is. They are arguing backwards to rationalize their beliefs. They are engaging in epistemic self-deception. Just because you have a belief that happens to be true does not mean that you're in a good position. What matters even more than having the right belief, I mean, really, having the right belief doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you arrived to the truth through a epistemically legitimate, real process, not a backwards rationalization. If you're an atheist, you should admit to yourself right now that you do not know whether God exists or not. And if you refuse to do that, you're failing at epistemology, because there's a fact. The fact is very simple, is that you don't know whether God exists or not. You can't possibly know that God does not exist. Now, you can rationalize it to yourself by saying, putting probabilities on it. You can say, well, yeah, Leo, technically I can't be 100% sure God doesn't exist, but I'm like 90% sure. No, that's horseshit. You don't know. Don't put probabilities on whether you think God exists or not. All your probabilities are shit. Just sit with you don't know. You don't know. That's what's true. You don't know. Beautiful. Not knowing is beautiful. Go with that. And if you're a theist, you got to get real honest with yourself that you don't know if God exists either. You have scriptures, you have beliefs, you have faith. All of that is shit. You don't know. You don't know. Just admit it to yourself. That's the truth. You don't know. Have you had an awakening? Are you conscious of God right now? Are you aware that this is God right now? Then you don't know. You don't know what I'm talking about. And if you do know, great, congratulations. You're awake. People cannot know how to explain God without not just one awakening, many awakenings, many, many, many awakenings. And there's not just God, there's many degrees of God. There's many, many degrees of understanding God. The amount of humans on this planet who can talk clearly, truthfully, and accurately about the structure of God is so few. Who can do it in an uncorrupted way. So few. It's so rare. You're lucky you found this communication right here. Very, very lucky. You can tell within minutes of speaking to somebody whether they have a direct understanding of God or not, or if it's just beliefs and theories and speculations. I can tell within a few minutes of listening to somebody. But that's only in retrospect, after all the work that I did, many, many deep awakenings. So the most important lesson in trying to understand God is that everything humans say about God is corrupt and misleading. Religious versions of God are silly, absurd, nonsensical, and unscientific. And as a skeptic, you're right to be skeptical of that. But also consider the possibility that even though humans did invent all sorts of silly notions of God, that underneath that, there could be something real and true. But there's a lot of layers of crap that you have to go through. And so this is what creates so much confusion. And so the whole point of this conversation is that I'm trying to help you to clear up this confusion, because there's very few people on this planet who can help you with this. Notice how many assumptions the arguments up above make. Everything boils down to these assumptions. For example, well, I'm going to give you a whole list of assumptions here in a second, but I just want to stress that that identifying hidden assumptions is really the core of this work. I'm not here to convince you to believe in God. I'm here to help you to learn how to identify epistemic assumptions, not just about God, but about anything that you want to understand about reality. And in this way, to avoid self-deception. So now I'm going to give you a list of examples of problematic assumptions that are very common through all of these different proofs and discussions of God. I'm going to quickly rattle through this list because we don't have a lot of time left. One assumption is you can't assume that properties and attributes of finite objects apply to infinite objects. That's a common assumption people have. You think that you can apply the logic of finite objects to an infinite object like God. Another assumption is that you can't assume that the dynamics from inside the universe apply to outside the universe. Another one is you can't extrapolate anything from a sample size of 1. For example, the universe existing is a sample size of 1. What are you going to do with that? If you want to say, well, how likely is it that the universe could exist? You can't make a probability calculation because it's a sample size of 1. Also, for example, with the origin of life, how likely is it that life could originate randomly? You don't know because you have a sample size of 1. We only have one example of life originating. And even there, we don't know how it happened. So you can't speculate or make any kind of conclusions from that. You also cannot use probabilities or Bayesian logic for this metaphysical work. You can't say, well, the probability for God existing is 50-50 or 1% or 99%. You can't do this. This is nonsense. It's baseless. You're just imagining probabilities that have no connection to reality. By the way, if you want to know, the probability of God existing is 100%. It's a tautology. There's no other possibility. You cannot assume that morality exists. You cannot assume how God would behave if God did exist. For example, Descartes famously makes some assumptions about how, like, God would, if God existed and God is all good and powerful and benevolent and loving, God would never deceive me. No, that's a false assumption. God would certainly deceive you. God is deceiving you right now. God is infinite self-deception. Also, you cannot assume God's designs or operations fit human needs, expectations, or intuitions. You cannot assume God cares about human morality. You cannot assume that God's attributes, what God's attributes or qualities are. You don't know. You cannot assume what humans say about God is true. Maybe God is evil. How do you know? You have to encounter God and then experience God to figure out, is it evil or not? You cannot assume that Scripture is true. You cannot assume that God's existence is necessary for the universe to be how it is. You cannot assume that the universe needs a cause. You cannot assume that something can't come from nothing. You should not assume that the universe is dumb as opposed to intelligent. You cannot assume the distinction between God and world, God and self, and God and evil. You cannot assume logical proof of God is possible. You can't assume that scientific method is valid to apply to metaphysical questions. Just because science works in the physical world does not mean that science will work on God, because God is a fundamentally different category of thing. You cannot assume that atheism is true. You cannot assume that free will exists. You should not assume that something and nothing are different from each other. You should not assume that one God versus many gods are different. You know, as an atheist, you might say, well, Leo, you're talking about one God, that's monotheism. But what about polytheism? Why can't there be multiple gods? If there could be one God, there could be multiple gods. So who's to say what's real? Well, what does that assume? That assumes that there's a difference between one and many gods. And of course, there isn't. You cannot assume that God and evolution are different things. They could be the same thing. You cannot assume that science is true. You cannot assume that consciousness cannot be generated by matter. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. You cannot assume that solipsism is untrue. You cannot assume that ultimate reality is sane. Remember we talked about sanity? You cannot assume that proof applies to God. You cannot assume that logic applies to God. You cannot assume that God can be conceptualized. You cannot assume that God is an object or a thing. You cannot assume that God can be formalized, quantified, objectified, or made third person. You cannot assume that you can run science experiments on God. You cannot assume that God is good. You cannot assume that God can be communicated. You cannot assume that God is Christian. You cannot assume any category or duality. You cannot assume that God fully knows itself. You cannot assume that God has only one form. You cannot assume that the Big Bang actually occurred, as science says. You cannot assume any limits or physical laws. You cannot assume that metaphysics is meaningless, impossible, or impractical. You cannot assume that God cannot be known. So, that's it for this episode, but we are not done with this topic, not even close. This, believe it or not, was just the appetizer. We just set up the beginning of the real conversation, which is going to be in the next episode, which is going to be called Why God Cannot Be Proven, where I will deconstruct the very notion of what a proof is, of what proof is. That's what all of this was about. This was just the entry point. So please stick with me on that. And then beyond that, there's going to be a third episode called Leo's Unique Proofs for God. Because see, I sat down and analyzed for days all these conventional proofs. I looked through them all. I did this analysis that I shared with you today. And as we saw here, most of these proofs are not very convincing. And then I realized, well, hell, I know God better than any of these people, so why don't I just make my own proofs? So I just sat down and made my own better proofs, and they're a lot better, more rigorous, much more powerful and profound and insightful than the stuff you've heard so far. So stick around for that. There's going to be about a handful of maybe like 7 or 8 of them that I'll share with you. All right, that's it for this one. Oh, and by the way, I just want to say, if you have not followed my blog, go check out my blog, go bookmark it. I put so much effort into my blog. These days, I put more effort into my blog than I do in my videos. So I'm posting a lot of important and profound stuff. If you're not following my blog, you're missing a lot of important insights and teachings that help to round out this video content that you're seeing here. And also, I just want to say, as a final note, that this whole project that I'm doing with Actualized.org, it's a catalog of all the most important concepts that are needed for understanding and making sense of reality and for living the good life, so to speak. I've been doing this for 12 years now, and there's a lot of content. And some of you start to get the sense that, oh, Leo's just repeating himself. It's just all more the same. And then kind of like, I know everything he has to teach, and that's it. We're like, it's over. We're done. We're not done. There's so much more. There's so much more. I have hundreds, literally hundreds of video topics planned and already in the works. It's just, it takes, you have to appreciate, please be patient with me. I haven't been posting as much content lately for health reasons and other reasons. I've just got burned out after 12 years of constant work. So I took some time off, but I'm coming back stronger now, and I'm going to be putting out more content, and it's going to be more advanced. The most advanced, sophisticated content is yet to come. As you see, every new video is getting more powerful and more clear as I'm clearing away my own corruptions from my own mind. And by the way, I've been doing a lot of that over this period where I haven't been putting out as much content. So it wasn't just that I was lazy. I was doing a lot of internal, important work to be able to reach new levels of understanding of reality. So that was very necessary. This is all part of a very long project. This is a multi-decade long project, perhaps a lifelong project. And this catalog of all these concepts is still incomplete. There's a lot of important stuff that's coming. So what I just want to encourage you is, like, you found a gold mine of powerful, life-changing insights that you're not likely to find again. Not that there are not great teachers out there. There definitely are, and I recommend you go find them. But it's hard to find teachings this clear and this powerful and this advanced for free. So, and more is coming, and it's going to get even more advanced and even more amazing. So I recommend that you don't get this attitude of like, oh, okay, yeah, I watched a few videos, and okay, I got it, Leo, I got it. Okay, there's nothing more. There's nothing, I figured it out. I'm telling you, it just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's all worth the time, right? You're investing time, but this is the best investment of time that you can make. Even though these videos seem so long, so unnecessarily long, eventually you'll realize and understand why they had to be this way, because our goal here is something much more profound and deep and holistic than any other teachings that you find out there. The breadth, the depth, the advanced, the interconnectedness that you're going to get here is going to be unparalleled. But you got to stick with me for the long haul. Think of this as not just you're watching a few videos to get a few little benefits here or there, or even to have an awakening. Way beyond all that, right? Like, this is a lifelong project. Stick with me for the rest of your life and take these insights seriously. The more seriously you take them, the more passionate you are about them, the more you're going to want to work them. The more you work them, the more benefit you'll get from them. Eventually, it's all going to snowball. It's all going to interconnect, but this takes time. This is a long-term project. I've invested my whole life into this. I recommend that you invest your whole life into this, into studying these teachings, if not from me, from other people. I don't care if it's from me. Invest your life into something that really matters, which is sense-making, avoiding self-deception, finding the concepts and insights that you need that are practical for building and advancing yourself and developing yourself to higher stages of consciousness. That's what life is really about. Everything else is nonsense, bullshit, noise, and distraction. That's what you find on the internet for the most part, with a few exceptions. I'm just reminding you of this. Those of you who have stuck with me for a long time, you already know this, but I'm just reminding you because it's easy to forget. There's so much noise. It's easy to get distracted, especially with our absurd political situation these days. Do not take your eye off the ball. Do not get distracted by stupid politics. Do not get distracted by market collapses and crashes and economic woes. This is what really matters. Everything else is noise. Stick with me.